Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight, we're dragging ourselves through the entire history of England. You'll hear of Druids standing in stone circles, Romans paving roads only for Saxons to promptly forget them, Vikings setting monasteries alight, and kings endlessly quarrelling with each other. This is not the polished tale of Shakespeare's green and pleasant land, nor the triumphalist march of empire. It's the far messier story of an island that was conquered, reconquered, reinvented, and somehow ended up thinking tea and cricket were the pinnacle of civilization. Before we set off through 2,000 years of dynasties, plagues, revolutions, and the occasional moment of brilliance, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair plus other sleep tools in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable, let's begin. To understand how England became itself, we first have to step back into a time before it had a name at all. If you strip away the myth and ceremony of later England, what you find at the beginning is a landscape of stones and silence. Long before anything that could be called England existed, people were scattering megaliths across the countryside, building monuments whose purpose remains equal parts mystery and guesswork. Stonehenge stands as the most famous of these, but it is only one of a many circles, causeways, and burial mounds that dot the chalk downs and moors. To modern eyes, they look timeless, but they were the work of farming communities who must have argued about where to put each slab, and who probably complained about the weather while dragging them across muddy ground. The impression is often one of solemn ritual, but the reality may have been far more prosaic. Local power, seasonal gatherings, and the never-ending attempt to make sense of a world dominated by cold winters and uncertain harvests. By the Iron Age, the island was full of hill forts, great rings of earth piled high, overlooking valleys and rivers. These were not castles in the medieval sense, but community centres, strongholds, and sometimes refuges. Inside, people lived in roundhouses with thatched roofs, raised livestock, and brewed a kind of beer that probably tasted like regret. The tribes who occupied these lands were not one united people, but a patchwork of chieftains and clans, trading, feuding, and occasionally sacrificing the unlucky to whichever gods were thought to be listening that day. If you had wandered through Britain in 500 BCE, you would not have seen a single Englishman, but you would have encountered people who saw themselves as part of a living, sacred landscape, half practical, half supernatural. It was into this world that the Romans peered curiously from across the Channel. Julius Caesar made the first move in 55 and 54 BCE, sailing over with legions who were more interested in a show of force than serious conquest. His reports back to Rome described a land of painted warriors, chariots clattering across fields, and tribes who alternated between fierce resistance and eager diplomacy. Caesar left almost as quickly as he arrived, content to declare victory in his memoirs, while the island slipped back into its old rhythms. For nearly a century afterward, Britain remained a rumour and a curiosity, a misty place full of tin, gold, and uncivilized people. Then in 43 CE, the Emperor Claudius decided that Britain was worth the trouble. Perhaps he wanted the glory of a conquest, or perhaps the empire's accountants had done the math on Britain's resources. Either way, Roman legions landed with the efficiency of a machine. Within a few years, they had carved out provinces, installed governors, and left behind garrisons to remind the locals who was in charge. Resistance came, of course. The most famous was led by Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, who in 60 CE rose against Roman rule after her daughters were assaulted and her land seized. Her rebellion burned towns, including London itself, to the ground before the Romans crushed it with merciless efficiency. The lesson was simple. Rome could be defied, but only briefly. Once the conquest was secure, Rome began to transform Britain. Roads were laid down in straight lines that still shape English geography today, running like scars across hills and valleys. Towns sprouted where forts had once been, with stone walls, baths and amphitheatres. Colchester, St Albans and York all began as Roman foundations, reminders that empire builds permanence even when it does not last forever. Roman villas appeared in the countryside, their mosaics and underfloor heating a luxury unimaginable to the local farmers, who still lived in smoky roundhouses. Latin inscriptions began to appear on milestones, and Christianity, carried by merchants and missionaries, slowly spread its strange new rituals into the mix of Celtic and Roman gods. But Rome never fully conquered Britain in the way it had subdued Gaul or Spain. Beyond the line of forts and roads, the north remained restless. The tribes of what is now Scotland resisted stubbornly, raiding and harassing whenever Rome pushed too far. The Emperor Hadrian eventually conceded the point by building a wall in the 120s CE, a great stone barrier stretching across the narrow neck of the island. Hadrian's wall was not so much an impregnable defence as a statement. Here is Rome, and there is not. Soldiers patrolled its mile castles, traders passed through its gates, and beyond it lay a land the empire had decided was simply not worth the bother. Life inside Roman Britain was a contradiction. In towns you could find temples to Jupiter alongside shrines to local deities, bathhouses steaming with imported luxuries, and markets humming with goods from across the empire. Wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, even glassware from the Mediterranean reached this damp northern province. Yet outside the towns, most people continued much as their ancestors had, scratching out harvests, tending animals, and occasionally glancing nervously at the tax collector. For the majority, Rome was not marble and mosaics. It was tribute paid in grain, and the occasional press gang taking sons for the legions. The province endured for centuries, a stable if often overlooked corner of the empire. Governors came and went, roads were repaired, villas expanded, and walls reinforced, but beneath the surface, cracks widened. As Rome faced crises on the continent, rebellions, invasions, emperors coming and going at alarming speed, Britain became less of a jewel and more of a burden. Garrisons were thinned, supplies grew irregular, and the soldiers left behind were often forced to fend for themselves. By the late 4th century, barbarian raids increased, and local leaders began to look less to Rome for protection and more to their own resources. By 410 CE, the Roman experiment in Britain had reached its end. The legions were withdrawn, called back to defend Italy itself against new waves of invaders. Towns that had been bustling fell into disrepair, villas collapsed into ruin, and the straight Roman roads began to crumble into muddy tracks once more. To the people left behind, it must have been bewildering. An empire that had seemed eternal simply packed up and left. Latin inscriptions weathered, mosaics cracked underfoot, and Christianity faltered in places where priests could no longer find patrons. The great stone walls remained, but the authority that had built them was gone. Britain was left with a vacuum. The roads still stretched across the countryside. The stone walls still stood, and a few Latin-speaking elites probably tried to keep things running, but the machinery of empire had vanished. Into this uncertainty came new arrivals from across the North Sea. The sources call them Angles, Saxons and Jutes, Germanic peoples who looked at Britain's fertile land and realised it was underdefended. They arrived first as mercenaries, hired by local rulers desperate for protection. But like all mercenaries, they quickly discovered that it was easier to carve out territory for themselves. By the middle of the 5th century, waves of settlers were establishing new communities in the southeast, reshaping the cultural and linguistic landscape of the island. The transition was messy. The native Britons, descendants of Celtic tribes and lingering Romanized elites, fought to hold on to their land. Some retreated into Wales and Cornwall, carrying with them the seeds of later Arthurian legend. Others were absorbed, their languages and customs blending with those of the newcomers. Over generations, the Germanic dialects spoken by these settlers fused into what we now call Old English, a language that looked nothing like the English you know today. To read Beowulf in the original is to encounter a tongue that is alien and familiar at once, full of kennings, alliteration, and words that feel like distant ancestors of modern speech. The English language was being born, and with it, the beginnings of an identity distinct from both Rome and the Celtic past. As these groups spread, they carved the island into a patchwork of kingdoms. There was no England yet, but there was Kent in the southeast, Sussex and Essex stretching out from their south and East Saxon names, and larger powers rising in the Midlands and north. Mercia, Wessex, and Northumbria became the heavyweights of this shifting landscape, each taking turns at dominance. For a time, Northumbria was preeminent, stretching from the Humber to the Forth, and fostering a flowering of learning in monasteries like Lindisfarne and Jarrow. It was there that Bede, the Venerable Bede, wrote his ecclesiastical history of the English people in the 8th century, providing one of the first coherent accounts of this fragmented era. His chronicle was as much theology as history, but it gave the island's peoples a sense of belonging to a shared story. Christianity, long battered during the post-Roman chaos, returned with renewed vigour during this period. Missionaries arrived from both Ireland and Rome, competing in their approaches but united in their determination. The story of St. Augustine of Canterbury, sent by Pope Gregory the Great in 597, is emblematic. Landing in Kent, he managed to convert its king, Ethelbert, and establish a foothold for Roman Christianity. Meanwhile, Irish monks carried their own traditions to the north, where they created distinctive practices and art, like the intricate knotwork of the Lindisfarne Gospels. The eventual Synod of Whitby in 664 settled many disputes in favour of the Roman style, but the fusion of influences produced a uniquely English Christianity, one that blended continental structure with Celtic creativity. The monasteries that spread across the landscape became centres of both faith and learning. In an age when most people lived in wooden huts and could expect little beyond subsistence farming, these stone sanctuaries seemed almost otherworldly. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, preserving not only scripture, but fragments of classical learning that might otherwise have vanished. They also composed new works in Old English, from homilies to epic poetry. It is from this period that Beowulf emerged, a tale of monsters, mead halls, and the fragile bonds of loyalty. While no one knows who composed it or exactly when, the poem reflects a society deeply concerned with honour, fate, and the inevitability of death, themes as relevant in smoky mead halls as they are today. Yet for all its cultural achievements, Anglo-Saxon society was hardly idyllic. It was hierarchical, with kings at the top, thanes beneath them, and a mass of ceorls and slaves supporting the structure. Law codes survive that detail finds for everything from murder to theft, and the careful calculations reveal a society constantly negotiating violence and order. The king was expected to be both warrior and lawgiver, his legitimacy resting on his ability to defend his people and reward his followers. A weak king could quickly lose support, and with so many neighbouring rulers ready to exploit any weakness, the political map was in perpetual flux. Power shifted south over time. After Northumbria's decline, Mercia under kings like Offa rose to prominence. Offa is remembered for his massive earthwork, Offa's Dyke, which still runs along the border with Wales, a monumental attempt to mark territory and deter raids. His rule was strong enough that he corresponded with Charlemagne on the continent, suggesting a king who saw himself as a player in the wider European stage. But Mercia's dominance did not last. By the 9th century, Wessex was emerging as the kingdom best poised to lead, its rulers consolidating power and laying the foundations for what would eventually become a unified England. Economically, Anglo-Saxon England was a world of villages, farms, and occasional market towns. Most people worked the land, growing barley, wheat, and rye, tending pigs in forests, and weaving cloth in small homesteads. But trade expanded steadily, both within the island and across the sea. Archaeological finds show coins minted in towns, glass beads from the continent, and even luxury goods that travelled surprisingly long distances. The North Sea was less a barrier than a highway, connecting these kingdoms to Scandinavia, Francia, and beyond. In that sense, England was never isolated. It was always part of a broader network of exchange and influence, even if the average peasant's world extended no farther than the next village. Despite their relative isolation compared to Rome, the Anglo-Saxons created an enduring cultural framework. Place names across England still echo their presence. Towns ending in ham, tun, and borough trace back to their settlements. The very concept of an English people grew from this period as scattered tribes gradually recognised shared language, customs, and faith. If you lived in Anglo-Saxon England, you would have seen loyalty to your kin and local lord as paramount, but you might also have begun to hear whispers of a broader identity, one that stretched beyond the boundaries of Mercia or Wessex. For several centuries, life followed this rhythm of farming, feasting, praying, and occasional fighting. Kings rose and fell, monasteries flourished, and poets sang of glory, while farmers hoped for decent harvests. To later generations, this was the heroic age, romanticised as a simpler time of brave warriors and noble kings. The reality was harder, muddier, and more precarious, but it laid the foundations of a culture that would outlast the kingdoms themselves. By the late 8th century, however, new clouds were gathering on the horizon, carried by sails from across the North Sea. Longships began to appear, their prows carved like dragons, carrying raiders who would test the resilience of these fragile kingdoms and usher in a new and violent era. The first sight of a Viking ship on the English coast must have been equal parts awe and terror. Long, sleek and shallow-keeled, these vessels could skim across open sea and then slip silently up rivers where no warning was given until the dragon-headed prow was already cutting into the shallows. In 793, the monks of Lindisfarne discovered this firsthand. Their monastery, perched on the northeastern coast, had been a beacon of learning and devotion. When the raiders arrived, they tore through the holy place with axes and fire, slaughtering some monks, enslaving others, and making off with whatever treasure they could carry. To contemporaries, this was more than a violent robbery, it was divine punishment. How else to explain pagans storming a Christian sanctuary with such apparent ease? The chronicles recorded it as an omen, and the omens, unfortunately, were correct. The following decades brought more raids. At first they came as hit-and-run attacks. Ships would appear, plunder, and vanish back into the mist. The monasteries, with their wealth and lack of defences, were frequent targets, but villages and towns were not spared. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, fragmented and often at odds with each other, struggled to coordinate a response. Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, and East Anglia all found themselves besieged in turn, with rulers scrambling to raise armies that were often too slow or too divided to intercept the raiders. The very mobility of the Vikings was their greatest weapon. They could strike anywhere and be gone before resistance arrived. For the ordinary villager, this meant an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. You could be sowing barley in your field one morning, and by nightfall watch your village burn, while strangers dragged away your neighbours in chains. What began as raids evolved into something more permanent. By the mid-9th century, Viking forces no longer seemed content with plunder alone. They began to winter in England rather than retreat to Scandinavia, establishing fortified camps and carving out territory. This escalation came to a head with what chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army of 865, a coalition of warriors who swept across the land with systematic intent. They toppled Northumbria, shattered East Anglia, and pressed hard against Mercia. The old balance of power among Anglo-Saxon kingdoms collapsed under this pressure, and only Wessex, under King Alfred, managed to survive. The Danelaw was established in the conquered areas, a vast swath of England where Viking law and custom prevailed. To the south and west lay what was left of Anglo-Saxon resistance, centred in Alfred's stubborn kingdom. Alfred the Great, as later generations named him, was not a natural-born warrior king. He struggled with ill health and at times was driven into hiding, famously retreating to the marshes of Athelney when Viking pressure seemed overwhelming. Yet from these low points came resilience. He reorganised the defence of his kingdom, creating a system of burhs, fortified towns, linked by a network of roads that allowed armies to mobilise quickly. He reformed the Fyrd, the part-time militia, into a more reliable force. Perhaps most importantly, he recognised the power of ideas. Alfred promoted learning, translated key works into Old English, and fostered a sense of shared identity among his people. If you lived under his rule, you might not have felt part of a unified England, but you would have sensed that there was something larger than your local village worth defending. Alfred's victories, most notably at the Battle of Edington in 878, forced the Viking leader Guthrum to accept baptism and withdraw into the Danelaw. This did not end the threat, but it established a boundary and gave Wessex breathing room. From that base, Alfred and his successors slowly expanded their influence. The dream of a united England was not yet realised, but the foundations were laid. His son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, continued the fight, reclaiming land from Viking control and strengthening the Anglo-Saxon hold. By the mid-10th century, under kings like Aethelstan, England was, for the first time, something close to a unified realm, stretching from the Channel to the borders of Scotland. Yet unity was fragile. Viking pressure never ceased entirely, and raiders continued to appear along the coasts. Wealth from trade and farming made England an attractive target, and kings who faltered found themselves quickly overwhelmed. The infamous Danegeld, a tax raised to pay off Viking armies, was both a practical measure and a sign of weakness. Why fight, some rulers reasoned, when you can simply bribe them to leave? The problem, of course, was that paying one group of raiders only encouraged another to show up expecting similar treatment. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, England was once again under severe pressure, with repeated invasions from Scandinavian kings determined not just to raid, but to rule. One of the most notorious reigns of this era was that of Ethelred the Unready. His epithet does not mean he was lazy, but that he was ill-advised, a polite medieval way of saying his decisions were consistently poor. Faced with renewed Viking onslaughts, Ethelred vacillated between attempted resistance and vast payments of Danegeld, draining the kingdom's resources while failing to solve the problem. the situation grew desperate, culminating in a massacre of Danish settlers in 1002, which only inflamed the cycle of violence. For many, this was the nadir of Anglo-Saxon kingship, a realm exhausted, divided, and unable to meet the challenge with strength. Into this chaos stepped a new figure, Cnut, son of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard. After a series of invasions and political manoeuvrings, Cnut emerged as ruler of England in 1016. Unlike earlier conquerors, he did not simply plunder and depart. He established a dynasty, marrying Ethelred's widow Emma of Normandy, and seeking to legitimise his rule in the eyes of both Anglo-Saxon nobles and his Scandinavian followers. Under Cnut, England was part of a North Sea empire that included Denmark and, briefly, Norway. To contemporaries, this was both startling and pragmatic. The once feared Viking raiders had now become the kings of the land they had terrorised. Cnut's reign brought relative stability, at least compared to the preceding decades of turmoil. He maintained many Anglo-Saxon institutions, balancing the interests of his new subjects with those of his Scandinavian allies. Monasteries flourished once again under royal patronage, and trade across the North Sea expanded. Though remembered as a foreign conqueror, Cnut was savvy enough to act as an English king, issuing law codes and cultivating the support of the church. Legends even sprouted around him, most famously the tale of him commanding the tide to halt, likely a moral story about the limits of royal power, rather than an actual case of regal megalomania. For a brief moment, England was united under the rule of a Danish king, its patchwork of kingdoms bound together within a larger Scandinavian empire. It was a unity born not of gradual consolidation alone, but of conquest and accommodation, a reminder that English identity was never formed in isolation. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had survived centuries of raids, endured near collapse, and reinvented themselves under constant Norse pressure. With Cnut's rise, the long struggle between raider and ruler seemed to reach an uneasy resolution. Yet as with so much in England's history, the stability was temporary. When King Cnut died in 1035, his carefully balanced North Sea empire quickly unravelled. His sons lacked his authority, and within a generation, the Scandinavian hold on England was broken. By 1042, the crown had passed to Edward the Confessor, a son of the old Anglo-Saxon royal line, who had spent much of his life in exile in Normandy. Edward's reign was marked by a curious blend of piety, indecision, and political intrigue. He was known for his devotion to the church, founding Westminster Abbey in its earliest form, but he left behind little in the way of heirs or clear succession plans. When he died childless in January 1066, the throne of England was up for grabs, and several powerful men believed they had the best claim. The first and most immediate candidate was Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex. Harold was the most powerful nobleman in England, practically running the government in Edward's later years. On Edward's deathbed, he was said to have designated Harold as his successor, and Harold wasted no time being crowned king. The problem was that two other figures thought themselves better qualified. Across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, argued that Edward had once promised him the throne during his years of exile. To make matters worse, Harold himself had allegedly sworn an oath to support William's claim, a promise likely made under duress but convenient propaganda for the Norman cause. Then to the north, Harald Hardrada of Norway, a formidable warrior king, asserted that an old agreement between his predecessor and Cnut's sons gave him the right to rule England. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic years in English history. Harold Godwinson faced the unenviable task of defending his crown against multiple invasions. First came Hardrada, who allied with Harold's own estranged brother, Tostig. They landed in the north, and won an initial victory at Fulford. Harold Godwinson marched his army with remarkable speed from the south and met them at Stamford Bridge near York in September 1066. The battle was brutal, but Harold achieved a decisive victory. Hardrada and Tostig were killed and the Norwegians routed. The triumph was short-lived. Even as Harold celebrated in the north, William of Normandy was preparing to land on England's southern coast. Barely had Harold's army caught its breath before they were forced to march back south, covering nearly 200 miles in a matter of weeks. Exhausted and undersupplied, they faced William's fresh, well-equipped force near the town of Hastings on October 14th, 1066. The battle that followed has been immortalised in the Bayeux Tapestry, a 70-metre embroidery that depicts cavalry charges, flying arrows, and Harold's dramatic death. The Anglo-Saxon army fought fiercely, forming a shield wall on the ridge, but the Normans employed tactics that eventually broke their line. A feigned retreat lured some English troops into pursuit, weakening the defence, and repeated cavalry assaults wore down the shield wall's resolve. Late in the day, Harold was struck down. Whether by an arrow to the eye or by Norman swords remains uncertain, but his death sealed the outcome. William had won. With Harold dead and his army shattered, William marched on London, receiving the submission of key nobles along the way. On Christmas Day 1066, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, the same church Edward had founded. For many Anglo-Saxons, it must have felt like a nightmare. Within a single year, their kingdom had gone from victory against the Norwegians to subjugation under a foreign duke. But William's conquest was only just beginning. Taking the crown was one thing, holding it required a complete transformation of English society. To secure his rule, William built castles, lots of them. Unlike the wooden hill forts of old, Norman castles were imposing stone structures designed to dominate the landscape. The Motte and Bailey design, with a keep perched on an artificial mound and a walled courtyard below, spread rapidly. Castles at places like Dover, Warwick, and the Tower of London were not just military fortresses, but symbols of permanent occupation. For villagers who had lived their entire lives in timber halls, the sight of a massive stone tower rising over their fields was a constant reminder of who now held power. Feudalism followed the castles. William parcelled out land to his Norman followers, displacing many of the Anglo-Saxon nobility. Loyalty was cemented through this land-holding system, with every baron owing service to the king in return for estates. For the common people, life remained harsh, but the identity of their lords changed abruptly. The language of the ruling elite was French, and while the peasants continued to speak Old English, the two tongues slowly began to intermingle. Everyday English words like cow or sheep sat alongside French terms like beef and mutton, a linguistic reminder of who raised the animals and who dined on them. Over centuries, this fusion would produce Middle English, but in the immediate aftermath, it produced confusion, resentment, and a sharp divide between rulers and ruled. To further consolidate control, William ordered a massive survey of his new kingdom in 1086. Known as the Domesday Book, it recorded landholdings, resources, and obligations across England with an astonishing level of detail. Every village, manor, and plough team was counted, as if the entire country had been laid bare to the crown's gaze. For the Anglo-Saxons, it felt like Judgment Day, hence the nickname Domesday. For historians, it remains one of the most extraordinary records of medieval Europe, a snapshot of a conquered land in transition. It revealed not only wealth, but devastation, for in the years immediately following the conquest, William had crushed resistance with brutal campaigns, particularly in the north. The harrying of the north left whole regions scorched and depopulated, a scar that would linger for generations. By the time of William's death in 1087, England had been utterly reshaped. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was largely gone, replaced by Norman lords. Castles and cathedrals altered the skyline, imposing stone where once timber had stood. The language of law, administration, and high culture was French, while the language of fields and villages remained Old English. The very structure of society had shifted, with feudal bonds linking lords to king in a way alien to earlier custom. What had once been an island of Germanic speech and Anglo-Saxon traditions was now ruled by French-speaking elites, whose culture would dominate for centuries. The Norman conquest was more than a change of rulers. It was a seismic event that transformed England's identity. Out of it came a hybrid society, where old traditions met new structures, and where the fusion of languages, laws, and customs created something distinct. It was not yet the England of later centuries, but it was no longer the England of Alfred or Canute. For better or worse, the island had been absorbed into the orbit of continental Europe, and its future would be shaped as much by what lay across the Channel as by what lay within its own shores. By the early 12th century, the Norman grip on England had solidified. William the Conqueror's heirs faced challenges, rebellions at home, disputes with each other, and occasional opportunists on the continent. But the framework of Norman rule endured. Castles dotted the countryside, cathedrals rose in Romanesque stone, and the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy had been almost entirely replaced by Norman lords. The kingdom was no longer a patchwork of half-independent earldoms. Instead, it was firmly tied to the authority of the crown, with land and loyalty distributed down the chain of feudal obligation. Life for the ordinary peasant changed little. They still toiled on manors, paid rents in labour or produce, and hoped for a good harvest. But the social hierarchy above them was now thoroughly continental. The most transformative shift came with the dynastic connections across the Channel. The kings of England were not only rulers of an island, but great lords in France. William's son, Henry I, and later his grandson, Henry II, inherited vast territories on the continent, making them as much French princes as English kings. The Plantagenet dynasty, beginning with Henry II in 1154, ruled what has sometimes been called the Angevin Empire, stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. To contemporaries, it seemed an extraordinary reach. To the kings of France, it seemed intolerable. England's fortunes were now tied not only to its own internal politics, but to an increasingly fraught rivalry with its continental neighbours. Henry II was a formidable monarch, both in ambition and in energy. He sought to impose royal justice more consistently across the land, curbing the arbitrary power of local lords. His itinerant judges travelled the kingdom, laying the groundwork for what would become English common law. Yet for all his legal reforms, Henry's reign was dominated by conflict, sometimes with neighbours, often with his own family, and famously with the church. His clash with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, ended in disaster. When Becket was murdered in the cathedral in 1170 by knights who thought they were carrying out the king's wishes, shock reverberated across Christendom. Becket was canonised almost immediately, and Henry was forced to do penance, a humiliation that revealed even powerful kings could stumble when they pressed too hard. If Henry II's reign was defined by authority and its limits, it was also defined by his marriage. His queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was one of the most remarkable figures of the medieval world. She had previously been Queen of France before her annulment from Louis VII, and her lands in Aquitaine made her one of the most desirable heiresses in Europe. By marrying Henry, She brought vast territories to the Plantagenet crown, but she also brought independence of mind and a political acumen that rivaled her husband's. Their relationship was tempestuous, marked by passion, quarrels, and eventually rebellion, as Eleanor supported her sons against Henry in their disputes. Her influence extended beyond politics into culture, as she became a patron of troubadours and the ideals of courtly love that coloured medieval notions of romance and chivalry. The Plantagenet family was as much soap opera as dynasty. Henry and Eleanor's sons, most famously Richard the Lionheart and John, were both products of this turbulent household. Richard spent much of his reign abroad, waging crusade in the Holy Land and fighting in France. Despite his absence, his reputation as a heroic warrior king grew, aided by legend and ballad. In England, however, his presence was rare, and the financial strain of his campaigns was deeply felt. Ordinary people knew him less as a lion-hearted crusader than as the reason taxes kept climbing. His brother John, by contrast, earned a darker legacy. He lost vast territories in France to the French king Philip II, earning him the disdain of his nobles. His quarrels with the barons and the church left him isolated and deeply unpopular, setting the stage for the confrontations that would dominate the early 13th century. Chivalry, meanwhile, flowered as both ideal and illusion. Knights swore oaths of loyalty, spoke of honour, and participated in tournaments that mixed real violence with theatrical display. Literature of the age romanticised the knightly class, weaving tales of Arthur's court, noble quests, and gallant behaviour. Yet beneath the poetry was a harder reality. Knights were as often violent opportunists as paragons of virtue, and the code of chivalry was as much an aspiration as a practice. Still, the imagery mattered, shaping how the ruling elite imagined themselves and leaving an enduring cultural legacy that persists in English identity to this day. While the nobility played at romance and intrigue, the church expanded its influence. Monastic orders flourished, with Cistercians carving out remote abbeys and cultivating land with remarkable efficiency. Cathedrals soared into Gothic grandeur, their spires reaching heavenward as visible testaments to faith and wealth. Pilgrimages became a feature of religious life, with Canterbury, the site of Becket's martyrdom, emerging as one of the great destinations. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing 2 centuries later, would immortalise the journey in the Canterbury Tales. But the impulse to travel for penance, healing, or spiritual merit was already well established by this era. Religion permeated every aspect of existence, offering hope and terror in equal measure to rich and poor alike. Despite cultural flourishing, the kingdom was often on unstable ground. England's entanglements in France drained resources, and the ambitions of kings frequently outstripped their ability to pay for them. Royal demands for taxes and service bred resentment among nobles who guarded their privileges jealously. The Plantagenet kings walked a narrow line, balancing the need to fund wars with the necessity of keeping their barons on side. A strong ruler like Henry II could manage it. A distracted one like Richard, or a weak one like John, could not. And when royal authority wavered, the barons were quick to press their advantage. By the opening years of the 13th century, the reign of King John had become a lesson in how quickly royal authority could unravel when combined with incompetence and ill fortune. John inherited the throne in 1199 after the death of his brother, Richard the Lionheart. Where Richard had been lionised for his crusading adventures, John was remembered for his failures at home and abroad. His troubles began almost immediately with the loss of Normandy in 1204 to King Philip II of France. The Anglo-Norman aristocracy, who had long held estates on both sides of the Channel, suddenly found their continental holdings gone, severing centuries of ties and exposing John's weakness. The dream of an Angevin Empire, stretching across France and England, dissolved in his hands, leaving only humiliation and resentment. John's reputation among his contemporaries was hardly glowing. Chroniclers described him as suspicious, cruel, and endlessly grasping. He taxed heavily to fund his futile wars in France, squeezing both nobles and churchmen until even his allies muttered. His disputes with the church escalated when he quarrelled with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope's candidate, Stephen Langton, was refused by John, who insisted on his own choice. The standoff led to England being placed under interdict in 1208, effectively suspending church services across the kingdom. For ordinary people, this meant no marriages, no funerals, and no sacraments, an extraordinary disruption in a society where the church mediated nearly every stage of life. John himself was eventually excommunicated. He only submitted when political reality forced his hand, accepting Langton and recognising the Pope's overlordship in 1213. It was a public climb down, and it did nothing to improve his standing among his barons. Meanwhile, John's military record only worsened. Determined to reclaim his lost lands in France, he launched campaign after campaign, demanding money and service from his nobles. His efforts culminated in the disastrous defeat at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, where his allies were crushed and his credibility shredded. For the barons, this was the final straw. They had endured years of arbitrary fines, scutage payments, a fee paid to avoid military service, and failed expeditions. Now, with the king's prestige in tatters, they sensed their chance. In 1215, a group of rebel barons confronted John with demands for reform. Their grievances were many: arbitrary imprisonment, extortionate taxation, and the king's disregard for customary rights. At first, John refused to negotiate, but as rebellion gathered momentum and London itself declared for the barons, he was forced to the table. The meeting place was a meadow beside the River Thames at Runnymede, a spot that would become one of the most famous in English history. There in June 1215, John affixed his seal to a document that would echo through the centuries: Magna Carta, the Great Charter. The Magna Carta was not, in its original form, a sweeping manifesto of liberty. It was, above all, a practical list of demands from disgruntled nobles. It limited the king's ability to levy taxes without the consent of his barons, guaranteed certain feudal rights, and promised that justice would not be sold, denied, or delayed. It also affirmed that even the king was bound by the law, a radical notion in an age when royal will had often seemed absolute. One clause insisting that no free man could be imprisoned except by lawful judgment of his peers would resonate far beyond its medieval context. But it is worth remembering that free men excluded the vast majority of the population. Peasants, villeins and serfs, the bulk of England's people, gained nothing tangible from the agreement. For them, the Great Charter was an event witnessed from a distance, with little bearing on their daily lives. Still, Magna Carta mattered. Even if it was born from baronial self-interest, it established a precedent that kings could not rule unchecked. Lawyers and later generations of politicians seized upon it, interpreting and reinterpreting its clauses to suit new circumstances. What had been a temporary truce in 1215 would, over the centuries, acquire the aura of a foundational document, cited in debates about rights, justice, and the limits of power. For the men at Runnymede, it was primarily a peace treaty. For posterity, it became a symbol. Of course, John being John, peace did not last. Within months of signing, he appealed to the Pope, who obligingly annulled the charter on the grounds that it had been forced upon the king under duress. Civil war erupted, with the barons inviting Prince Louis of France to take the English throne. The country teetered on the brink of foreign rule once again. John, however, did not live to see the conflict resolved. He died in October 1216, likely of dysentery contracted while campaigning in the east of England. His death spared him further humiliation and allowed his 9-year-old son, Henry III, to succeed under the regency of loyal supporters who quickly reissued a revised Magna Carta to pacify the rebels. The reissuing of the charter began a tradition, though many of its clauses would be revised, deleted, or reinterpreted. Magna Carta endured as a living document, reasserted by successive kings as a gesture of goodwill to their barons. Over time, its symbolic weight grew out of all proportion to its practical origins. To medieval nobles, it was a reassurance that their privileges were protected. To lawyers, it was a treasure trove of precedent. To peasants, it remained largely irrelevant. Yet the idea that no one, not even the king, was above the law became a cornerstone of English political identity. The monarchy that emerged from the Magna Carta crisis was constrained in new ways, though not transformed. Kings still wielded enormous power, but they had to reckon with the fact that rebellion could be justified by appeals to principle as well as to custom. Barons had learned that unity could force concessions. The church, too, had asserted its influence, acting as mediator and occasionally as enforcer. The balance of authority in England had shifted ever so slightly, tilting away from absolute royal command toward a more negotiated form of rule. Yet instability lingered. The child king Henry III would grow into a monarch whose long reign was marked by repeated clashes with his nobles, proving that Magna Carta had not settled disputes so much as reframed them. The relationship between kings and their barons would continue to oscillate between cooperation and confrontation, with the lessons of 1215 invoked time and again whenever royal ambition threatened to overstep. What began as a desperate baronial revolt against a deeply unpopular king had planted a seed, the recognition that even monarchs had limits. England's medieval kingdom was no more stable after Runnymede than before, but it was slightly less absolute, and in that adjustment lay the beginning of a new political tradition. By the 14th century, England's rulers had recovered somewhat from the humiliation of King John's disastrous reign. The Plantagenet line endured, though their authority was always tempered by baronial memory of Magna Carta. Yet the pull of France remained irresistible. The Angevin dream of a cross-channel empire might have collapsed, but English kings still clung to fragments of territory on the continent, particularly Aquitaine. These holdings were both lucrative and contentious, and they placed the English crown in constant rivalry with the French monarchy. In 1337, this rivalry escalated into a conflict so prolonged it would define the era, the 100 Years' War. The spark was dynastic. When the French King Charles IV died in 1328, without a male heir, the crown passed to Philip VI, a cousin from the Valois line. Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV through his mother Isabella, believed his claims stronger. The French, however, refused to accept inheritance through the female line, and Edward, though initially paying homage to Philip, eventually pressed his own case. In 1337 he formally declared himself the rightful King of France, a bold move that turned dynastic squabble into open war. For Edward, it was an assertion of prestige and ambition. For his subjects, it was the beginning of a conflict that would drain resources, shape identities, and drag on, with pauses for more than a century. Early campaigns revealed the strengths and weaknesses of both sides. The French boasted heavy cavalry, the traditional backbone of medieval warfare. Knights in gleaming armour charging with lances, had long dominated battlefields. The English, however, possessed a weapon that would prove devastating: the longbow. Drawn from the forests of Wales and practiced since boyhood, English archers could unleash volleys of arrows that pierced armour and disrupted cavalry charges before they reached the line. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, Edward III demonstrated the effectiveness of this new model of warfare. Outnumbered, the English formed defensive positions and rained arrows on wave after wave of French knights. The result was slaughter. French chivalry lay broken in the mud, cut down not by noble lances but by yeoman archers. It was a humiliation for France and a revelation for Europe. The age of the knight was waning. The victory at Crécy was followed by further English successes. In 1347, the port city of Calais fell after a long siege, giving England a valuable foothold on the continent. The city would remain under English control for more than 2 centuries, a tangible reminder of Edward's gains. A decade later, in 1356, Edward's son, the Prince of Wales, remembered as the Black Prince, won a stunning victory at Poitiers. Once again, English archers devastated French cavalry, and the French King John II was captured and carried off to London. For a time it seemed England had the upper hand. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 granted Edward extensive territories and marked a high point of English ambition. Yet war is rarely static. The French adapted, avoiding set-piece battles where longbows could dominate, and turning instead to skirmishes and attrition. Internal strains also hampered the English. Maintaining armies overseas was ruinously expensive, and while victories brought prestige, they also brought crushing taxation at home. Parliament grew more assertive as kings begged for funds, linking the granting of taxes to demands for reform. The war, in effect, strengthened the voice of England's political institutions, even as it bled its treasury dry. After a lull, hostilities flared again in the reign of Henry V. Young, energetic, and determined to revive English fortunes, Henry launched a campaign in 1415 that culminated in the famous Battle of Agincourt. Outnumbered and facing a larger French force, Henry relied once more on the discipline of his archers. The battlefield, sodden with mud, became a death trap for heavily armoured knights who struggled to advance under a hail of arrows. Chroniclers describe the French pressing forward only to collapse in heaps, trampled by their own men. English casualties were light, French losses catastrophic. The victory cemented Henry's reputation as a warrior king and gave rise to Shakespeare's stirring lines centuries later, immortalising Agincourt as a triumph of grit over grandeur. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 appeared to secure England's position. Henry was recognised as heir to the French throne and married Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter. For a moment, it seemed plausible that England and France might be united under a single crown, but fate, as so often in history, intervened. Henry died unexpectedly in 1422, leaving his infant son as king of both realms in name but master of neither in practice. With a child on the throne and the English position stretched thin, the tide began to turn. It was during this period of fragility that Joan of Arc emerged. A peasant girl from Domremy, claiming divine visions, she rallied French forces and inspired a nation weary of defeat. Her role at the lifting of the siege of Orléans in 1429 was pivotal, galvanizing French morale and convincing many that God favoured their cause. Though captured by the Burgundians and handed to the English, who tried and executed her as a heretic in 1431, her martyrdom only deepened her symbolic power. France, long demoralised, found renewed unity, and English fortunes dwindled accordingly. As the 15th century wore on, England's continental holdings shrank. The war dragged in intermittent phases, with truces and treaties punctuating renewed hostilities, but the broader trend was clear. France was consolidating, and England was overextended. In 1453, the fall of Bordeaux marked the effective end of English rule in Aquitaine, territory that had been part of the crown's inheritance since Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage 3 centuries earlier. Calais remained, but the dream of ruling France was gone. For England, the conclusion of the 100 Years' War was sobering. What had begun as a bold claim to the French throne ended in retreat and exhaustion. The prestige of victories like Crécy and Agincourt could not obscure the final reality. England's continental ambitions had been checked, and the cost had been immense. Financially drained, politically strained, and socially unsettled, the kingdom returned home with little to show for more than a century of struggle, but a battered pride and a lingering sense of grievance. The war left legacies nonetheless. The longbowman became an enduring symbol of English martial identity, celebrated in song and story as the common man who toppled knights. Parliament's role in taxation and governance grew stronger, laying foundations for future struggles between Crown and Commons. The sense of England, as distinct from France, once blurred by dynastic ties, hardened into a clearer national identity. Yet in the immediate aftermath, none of these would have felt like victories. What lingered was the humiliation of loss and the heavy realisation that England's destiny lay less across the Channel than within its own contested borders. In the midst of England's martial adventures in France, a different kind of enemy slipped quietly ashore. In 1348, ships arrived on the southern coast carrying not soldiers, but fleas, and not armies, but a bacterium that would devastate the kingdom. The Black Death, as it came to be known, spread with terrifying speed. Within a year, it had cut a swath through towns and villages alike, sparing neither lord nor labourer. Chroniclers wrote of swollen buboes, fevers, and death within days. Priests died as quickly as their parishioners, leaving parishes without spiritual care. Corpses piled faster than they could be buried. Some estimates suggest that nearly half the population of England perished between 1348 and 1350. No battle, however bloody, had ever wrought such destruction. The psychological shock was immense. To medieval minds, explanations varied. Some saw divine punishment for sin, others blamed poisoned wells or malign planetary alignments. Rumours spread of scapegoats, though in England the violence against minority groups was less intense than in parts of continental Europe. Still, the overwhelming sense was that the familiar order of life had collapsed. Entire villages were abandoned when too few remained to till the fields. In towns, trade faltered, workshops closed, and guilds found their apprentices gone. Those who survived must have lived with both relief and survivor's guilt, walking through streets where half the faces they once knew had vanished. Yet in the wake of devastation came unintended consequences. With so many dead, labour became scarce. For the first time in living memory, peasants and workers had leverage. Landowners, desperate to have their fields ploughed and their harvests gathered, were forced to offer better terms. Wages rose, mobility increased, and some villains, peasants bound to their lord's land, found ways to slip out of servitude altogether. The rigid feudal order, already creaking, began to bend under the weight of economic reality. For peasants who had long been trapped in poverty, this was a rare opening, though one shadowed by grief. The ruling elite, however, was not inclined to accept such shifts meekly. In 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, attempting to fix wages at pre-plague levels and bind workers to their manors. It was an act of desperation, and one that proved unenforceable. Laws could be written, but they could not conjure labour out of thin air. nor could they force peasants to forget the new bargaining power they had glimpsed. Tensions simmered between landowners who sought to claw back their authority and workers who sensed that the world had tilted ever so slightly in their favour. As the 14th century wore on, these tensions only deepened. The costs of the 100 Years' War remained heavy, and kings turned to taxation to fund campaigns across the Channel. The burden fell hardest on the common people, who saw little benefit from victories in distant France. In 1377, a poll tax was levied, charging every adult the same rate regardless of wealth. For wealthy merchants or lords, it was an inconvenience. For peasants already struggling, it was infuriating. When the tax was repeated and increased in 1380, resentment boiled over. In 1381, rebellion erupted. The Peasants' Revolt, the largest popular uprising England had yet seen. The revolt began in Essex and Kent, spreading rapidly as villagers and townsfolk refused to pay the hated tax and turned on local officials. Under leaders like Wat Tyler and inspired by radical preachers such as John Ball, they marched on London, swelling in numbers as they went. Their demands went beyond the poll tax. They called for the abolition of serfdom, fair rents, and an end to the privileges of the ruling elite. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the old order might truly be overturned. Chroniclers describe crowds entering the capital, burning records, and attacking symbols of authority. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Treasurer were dragged from the Tower of London and executed by the rebels. To the elite, this was anarchy. To the participants, it was justice long denied. The young King Richard II, only 14 at the time, rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End. Remarkably, he promised to hear their grievances, issuing charters of freedom and pardon. For a fleeting moment, hope spread among the rebels that their cause had triumphed. But the fragile trust shattered at Smithfield a few days later. There, during a tense parley, Wat Tyler was killed. Accounts differ on whether he was struck down in anger by the king's men or in a scuffle gone wrong. Richard, showing remarkable composure for his age, rode forward and declared himself the sole leader of the Commons, persuading the rebels to disperse. Once their numbers had dissolved, royal forces moved swiftly to crush the movement. The promised charters were revoked, leaders hunted down, and vengeance meted out with predictable severity. The revolt had failed, but it had left scars. The ruling class was shaken by how close rebellion had come to overturning the social order. For the common people, the lesson was bitter. Promises of reform could be dangled and withdrawn, and the weight of authority could reassert itself with brutal force. Yet the ideas voiced in 1381 did not vanish. John Ball's words, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" echoed through the centuries as a challenge to hierarchy. The revolt may have been crushed, but it revealed how fragile the structures of power could become when pressed too hard. In the long term, the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt reshaped England. The population never returned to its pre-plague level for generations, keeping labour valuable and weakening the grip of serfdom. Many manors shifted from labour dues to rents, a subtle but significant change that undermined the old feudal model. The church, battered by both plague mortality and popular anger at corrupt officials, faced growing criticism that would one day erupt in reformation. Meanwhile, the monarchy, though still powerful, had to contend with a society altered at its core. Fewer people, more assertive workers, and a lingering sense of disillusionment. By the close of the 14th century, England was a changed land. The Black Death had cut its population in half, stripping away any illusion of permanence or stability. The Peasants' Revolt had shown that the poor could rise, even if only briefly, and that their grievances could shake the kingdom to its foundations. What remained was a society at once weakened and transformed, haunted by memory of plague pits and rebellion, and wary of promises that rang hollow. The kingdom survived, but it was leaner, harsher, and less certain of itself than before. Fewer people walked its fields, but those who did carried the memory of loss and the suspicion that their rulers had learned nothing at all. Into this fragile landscape stepped a king who embodied the kingdom's weakness all too well. Henry VI, crowned as a child in 1422, grew into a man ill-suited to rule. Gentle, pious, and indecisive, he was perhaps better fitted for a monastery than a throne. Unfortunately, he inherited not just a crown, but the lingering weight of the 100 Years' War. When France regained momentum under Joan of Arc and her successors, Henry presided over the steady collapse of English possessions abroad. By 1453, only Calais remained. The humiliation abroad mirrored instability at home. A king unable to inspire confidence invited rivals to challenge his authority. The weakness of Henry VI's reign turned England's political elite into factions. Powerful nobles, many descended from the sprawling Plantagenet line, began to see opportunity in his incompetence. Chief among them was Richard, Duke of York, who had a strong blood claim to the throne through his mother's lineage. Initially, Richard was appointed protector of the realm during Henry's bouts of mental illness, but the arrangement only highlighted the fragility of royal authority. When Henry recovered his faculties, however tenuously, his queen, Margaret of Anjou, worked tirelessly to defend their young son's inheritance. What followed was less the orderly transfer of power than a series of vendettas and shifting alliances that spiraled into civil war. The wars that erupted are remembered by their emblematic symbols, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. In reality, the emblems were more a later invention than battlefield identifiers, but they capture the dynastic bitterness of the conflict. Between 1455 and 1487, England endured a series of violent struggles for the crown, battles that bled noble houses dry and left ordinary people caught in the wake of ambition. It was not one continuous war, but a series of campaigns, truces, and betrayals, each reigniting as soon as one faction sensed weakness in the other. The opening salvo came at the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, where the Duke of York's forces clashed with the King's. The result was a Yorkist victory and the beginning of open conflict. Henry was captured, though treated with deference, and Richard gained renewed influence. For a while, the kingdom drifted between uneasy truces and eruptions of violence. When Richard of York himself was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, his claim did not die with him. His son Edward inherited the mantle and proved himself a far more capable commander. Edward of York's victory at Towton in 1461 was decisive. Fought in a snowstorm and described as one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil, it left thousands dead. In its aftermath, Edward was proclaimed Edward IV, displacing Henry VI and the Lancastrian line. Edward's reign brought a measure of stability, but the scars of Towton ran deep. Margaret of Anjou continued to fight for her son's cause, rallying Lancastrian resistance where she could. For the ordinary Englishman, this meant uncertainty. Oaths of loyalty might be demanded 1 year to Lancaster, the next to York. Depending on who controlled the local castle, Edward IV proved an energetic ruler, but one hampered by the shifting loyalties of his own supporters. The most notorious was Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, remembered by history as the Kingmaker. At first, Warwick had been Edward's ally, instrumental in securing his throne. But as disagreements grew, particularly over Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner by noble standards, Warwick turned against him. The Kingmaker switched sides, briefly restoring Henry VI to the throne in 1470. The episode was short-lived. Edward regrouped, returned with force, and crushed Warwick at the Battle of Barnet in 1471. On the same day, Henry VI's son, Edward of Westminster, was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury, effectively extinguishing the Lancastrian line of succession. Soon after, Henry VI himself was found dead in the Tower of London, likely murdered on Edward IV's orders. The Yorkists seemed triumphant, yet dynastic wars are rarely settled so neatly. Edward IV reigned until his sudden death in 1483, leaving behind young heirs. The crown passed to his 12-year-old son, Edward V, but the boy's reign barely began. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared the children illegitimate and seized the throne as Richard III. The princes, Edward V and his brother, were taken to the Tower and disappeared. Their fate remains one of England's enduring mysteries, but few doubt they were quietly eliminated. Richard's usurpation alienated many, even among Yorkist supporters. A king who gained power by dispatching his nephews was not easily embraced. Richard III's brief reign was marked by suspicion and unrest. Though capable on the battlefield and not without administrative talent, he could not shake the taint of his rise. Discontent coalesced around a distant but viable claimant, Henry Tudor. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, descended from John of Gaunt, gave him Lancastrian blood, though through an illegitimate line later legitimised. More importantly, he was a figure around whom disaffected nobles could rally. From exile in Brittany, Henry launched his bid for the throne, landing in Wales in 1485 and gathering support as he marched eastward. The climactic moment came at the Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22nd, 1485. Richard's army outnumbered Henry's, but treachery and hesitation within his ranks proved decisive. The Stanleys, a powerful family who had pledged vague support to both sides, chose at the crucial moment to back Henry. Richard, displaying courage, if not prudence, led a direct charge against Henry himself. He cut down Henry's standard-bearer and nearly reached his foe before he was surrounded and slain. His crown, said to have been retrieved from a bush after the battle, was placed on Henry's head. With Richard dead, the Yorkist cause collapsed, and Henry Tudor became Henry VII. The Wars of the Roses ended not with a treaty, but with the death of a king on the battlefield. After decades of bloodshed, shifting allegiances, and dynastic bitterness, England had a new ruler who promised stability. Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, would symbolically unite the houses of Lancaster and York, ending the feud that had torn the realm apart. But in 1485, as he stood victorious at Bosworth, what mattered was that a new dynasty had risen. The Tudors would dominate the next century of English history, reshaping the kingdom in ways none of the exhausted survivors of civil war could have imagined. When Henry Tudor emerged from the carnage of Bosworth Field in 1485, crowned with a battered circlet retrieved from a bush, he was less the triumphant founder of a dynasty than a man who had managed to outlast his rivals. His claim to the throne was tenuous, rooted in the Beaufort line, descendants of John of Gaunt, born illegitimately and only later legitimised. What secured his position was not blood alone, but survival, timing, and the sheer exhaustion of a nobility weary from decades of war. England had been bleeding itself dry through the Wars of the Roses, and Henry's victory offered a chance, however fragile, for stability. He understood this from the start and built his reign on caution, calculation, and an iron grip on power. Henry VII's early years were consumed by the need to eliminate threats to his crown. Usurpers and pretenders emerged quickly, exploiting the confusion of dynastic change. The most dangerous was Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the vanished princes in the Tower. Warbeck found backers in Burgundy, Scotland, and even among disaffected English nobles, reminding Henry that old loyalties could always resurface. Another challenge came from Lambert Simnel, presented as a Yorkist heir, and even crowned in Dublin. Henry dealt with both with ruthless pragmatism. Simnel, captured after his rebellion collapsed, was humiliated but spared, set to work in the royal kitchens. Warbeck, by contrast, was hanged in 1499 after years of being paraded as a false claimant. Henry's leniency could be selective, but his message was clear. Rebellion would not be tolerated, and the days of shifting thrones were over. Beyond crushing rivals, Henry focused on strengthening the monarchy's financial base. He was notorious for his frugality, squeezing revenue through fines, bonds, and careful management of royal lands. His financial officers, men like Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, became infamous for their rigorous collection of debts. Nobles grumbled, but the crown's coffers filled. By the end of his reign, Henry had restored the monarchy's solvency, a vital resource for a dynasty that needed to project stability. The Tudor monarchy would be remembered for grandeur under his son and granddaughter, but its foundations were laid in Henry VII's meticulous, sometimes miserly accounting. Henry also reshaped the nobility's relationship to the throne. The Wars of the Roses had shown the danger of over-mighty subjects who could field private armies rivaling the king's. Henry curtailed this practice with strict laws against retaining, employing large numbers of liveried followers. He demanded bonds and recognizances, financial penalties that bound nobles to good behaviour. Step out of line, and your purse would feel it. These measures did not make Henry loved, but they made him secure. The nobility, long accustomed to jockeying for royal favour with armed force, found themselves constrained by paperwork, fines, and the quiet but relentless pressure of royal oversight. While control at home was essential, Henry knew that marriage could achieve what armies often could not. He sealed his victory by marrying Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, uniting the houses of Lancaster and York in one symbolic gesture. The Tudor rose, red and white petals combined, was a potent emblem of reconciliation, though one that glossed over the blood spilled to reach it. Through his children, Henry sought to secure alliances abroad. His eldest son Arthur was married to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. This union tied England to one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe, signalling that the Tudors were not mere opportunists, but legitimate players on the continental stage. Tragedy struck in 1502 when Arthur died suddenly, leaving his younger brother Henry as heir. Catherine, still young and politically valuable, remained in England. Henry VII, ever cautious, hesitated over her future, uncertain whether marrying her to his surviving son would be advantageous or canonically permissible. The decision was deferred, and it would fall to Henry VIII to resolve, with consequences far greater than Henry VII could have imagined. For the moment, though, the dynastic web was strong. His daughters were married into Scottish and European nobility, extending Tudor influence across borders. Every match was a strategic calculation, reinforcing the dynasty's legitimacy and international standing. Despite his cautious nature, Henry VII was not without vision. He promoted trade, signing treaties with Burgundy and Spain to expand English commerce. The merchant classes of London and Bristol found new opportunities under his rule, and voyages of exploration, though modest compared to those of Spain and Portugal, began to creep into English ambition. The most famous was John Cabot's 1497 voyage to Newfoundland, a precursor to later English claims in the New World. For now, Henry showed little interest in transatlantic conquest, but he laid the groundwork for a kingdom that would one day look far beyond its shores. Culturally, the court of Henry VII was restrained compared to the glitter of his successors. This was a king who had fought hard for his throne and had no intention of squandering it on spectacle. Yet the seeds of Renaissance influence were present. Italian humanism trickled into England, scholars corresponded with continental thinkers, and the royal household fostered an environment in which learning and diplomacy flourished. Henry's reign was not a golden age of culture, but it was a period of consolidation that allowed such things to bloom later under his children. Henry's reign was not without shadows. His reliance on unpopular ministers like Empson and Dudley, who became symbols of fiscal oppression, bred resentment. When Henry died in 1509, their swift arrest and execution under his son was a popular gesture. Yet even critics could not deny that Henry had left behind something England had not known in decades: stability. The throne passed peacefully to his heir. The coffers were full, and the dynasty was secure. Compared to the chaos of the previous century, this was no small achievement. Henry VII's legacy is often overshadowed by the flamboyance of his son and the triumphs of his granddaughter. He was no warrior king like Henry V, no cultural icon like Elizabeth I. Instead, he was a cautious survivor, a man who turned uncertainty into control and chaos into order. He had won his throne on a battlefield, but ruled it through patience, calculation, and quiet ruthlessness. His methods might not have inspired love, but they created a dynasty strong enough to endure. When Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509 at the age of 17, England seemed to have stepped into a brighter age. Gone was his father's dour frugality and suspicion. Here was a young king who embodied energy, charm, and magnificence. Court chroniclers praised his athleticism, his skill in jousts and hunting, and his learning. He spoke several languages, played music, and wrote poetry. To the people of England, he appeared the ideal Renaissance prince, handsome, gifted, and brimming with promise. Early in his reign, he was welcomed with enthusiasm, a breath of fresh air after the careful bookkeeping of Henry VII. But youthful promise has a way of fading under the weight of ambition, and in Henry's case, ambition would reshape both crown and kingdom. At first, Henry's reign followed a familiar course. He pursued military glory, launching campaigns against France in the old Plantagenet tradition. Though victories were limited and costly, they gave him the aura of a warrior king, eager to match the feats of Henry V at Agincourt. He also cultivated an image as a defender of the Catholic faith, penning a treatise against Martin Luther that earned him the papal title Defender of the Faith. Yet behind the tournaments and rhetoric, Henry's marriage weighed heavily on his dynasty. He had wed Catherine of Aragon, his brother Arthur's widow, with papal dispensation. For years the match seemed fruitful, binding England to Spain and producing several children. But most died young, and only one daughter, Mary, survived. The absence of a surviving son gnawed at Henry, whose vision of dynastic strength depended on male heirs. By the late 1520s, Henry had convinced himself that his lack of sons was a sign of divine disapproval. He sought annulment from Catherine, arguing that the marriage had been invalid from the start. Catherine, unsurprisingly, refused to accept this. The Pope, caught between Henry and Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V, stalled. Henry, impatient and increasingly determined, resolved to take matters into his own hands. With the guidance of ministers like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, he engineered a break with Rome. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. What had begun as a personal marital crisis became a seismic political and religious shift. The consequences were immense. The break from Rome allowed Henry to annul his marriage and wed Anne Boleyn, the glamorous courtier who had captured his attention. But it also unleashed reforms that transformed the English church. Monasteries, long centres of wealth and learning, were dissolved. Their lands and treasures were seized by the crown, enriching Henry and redistributing property to loyal nobles. For monks and nuns, it was the end of centuries-old institutions. For ordinary villagers, it often meant the loss of hospitals, schools, and alms once provided by religious houses. The dissolution of the monasteries filled the royal coffers, but it also stripped away the old fabric of community life, leaving behind ruins that still scar the English landscape. Henry's marital adventures did not end with Anne Boleyn. She gave birth in 1533 to Elizabeth, a healthy daughter, but not the son Henry so desperately craved. Within a few years, Anne's inability to bear a male heir and the political enemies she had accumulated sealed her fate. Accused of adultery and treason, she was executed in 1536, the first of Henry's queens to lose her head. Henry quickly married Jane Seymour, who finally provided the male heir he wanted with the birth of Edward in 1537. Jane, however, died shortly after childbirth, leaving Henry genuinely grief-stricken. In his mind, Jane had been the perfect wife, and her memory remained untainted by the suspicion and drama that plagued the others. Subsequent marriages did little to restore Henry's personal contentment. His union with Anne of Cleves in 1540 was arranged for diplomatic reasons, but collapsed almost immediately. Henry claimed he found her unattractive, annulling the marriage within months, though Anne was spared and lived comfortably as the king's beloved sister. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, was not so fortunate. Barely in her teens when she caught Henry's eye, she was executed for adultery in 1542, another queen undone by rumour, evidence, and the king's wrath. His sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, outlived him, a pragmatic partner who nursed the increasingly ailing king and managed to avoid the fate of her predecessors. The tally of 6 wives, 2 divorced, 2 executed, 1 who died, and 1 who survived, became the most infamous legacy of Henry's personal life. The king himself changed drastically over the course of his reign. The young athlete who had dazzled the court became a bloated figure in later years, plagued by ill health, ulcers, and temper. He grew paranoid, executing ministers and former allies with little hesitation. Thomas More, who had opposed his break with Rome, was sent to the scaffold. Cromwell, once his trusted architect of reform, was likewise executed when his policies or his usefulness faltered. Henry wielded power with an increasingly heavy hand, ruling through fear as much as loyalty. His court, once a place of brilliance and pageantry, became a stage for intrigue, suspicion, and sudden downfall. Religiously, Henry's policies left England in limbo. He rejected papal authority, but retained much Catholic doctrine, leaving a Church of England that was neither fully Protestant nor fully Catholic. The Bible was translated into English, but traditional practices lingered. For many ordinary believers, the changes were bewildering. One year saints' shrines were honoured, the next they were destroyed. One year the king denounced heretics, the next he tolerated reformers. The ambiguity left a legacy of uncertainty that his heirs would inherit, each pushing the kingdom in different religious directions. By the time of Henry's death in 1547, the question of succession remained precarious. His son Edward, though the long-awaited male heir, was only 9 years old and frail in health. Mary, his daughter by Catherine of Aragon, was a devout Catholic, while Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, was young and associated with Protestant reform. Henry's will attempted to secure the line through Edward first, then Mary, then Elizabeth. But the divisions he had sown ensured that the transition would be anything but smooth. The dynasty he had fought so hard to secure was balanced precariously on the lives of 3 children, each embodying a different vision for England's future. Henry VIII left behind a kingdom transformed but unsettled. The monasteries were gone, the Church of England was born, and the crown was wealthier and more powerful than it had been in centuries. Yet the costs were profound. Families displaced by the dissolution, religious divisions deepening across society, and a monarchy scarred by tyranny all pointed toward turbulence ahead. The image of Henry himself, once the Golden Prince, later the tyrannical, overweight king, mirrored the arc of his reign. Brilliance shadowed by brutality, promise undone by excess, stability had given way to uncertainty, and the succession that followed him would determine whether his legacy endured or collapsed. When Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, England was exhausted by years of religious whiplash. Her brother Edward VI had pushed Protestant reforms. Her sister Mary I had swung the pendulum back to Catholicism with fire and execution, and now Elizabeth inherited a realm wary of further upheaval. At just 25, she was young, intelligent, and determined to secure her place. The daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, her legitimacy had once been questioned, but Elizabeth had learned resilience in the shadow of uncertainty. Her first task was to stabilise the crown, and she did so with a blend of pragmatism and political instinct that would define her reign. Religious settlement was her immediate challenge. Elizabeth crafted what became known as the Elizabethan religious settlement, a middle path that established Protestant doctrine while retaining some Catholic ceremony. The Act of Supremacy in 1559 reasserted the monarch's authority over the Church of England, but Elizabeth styled herself Supreme Governor rather than head, a compromise designed to ease consciences. The Act of Uniformity enforced the use of a revised Book of Common Prayer. It was not perfect. Hardline Protestants and Catholics both bristled, but it created a workable framework that allowed the realm to move past the destructive oscillations of the previous 2 decades. For ordinary parishioners, it meant fewer bonfires and more predictable Sundays. With the throne stabilised, Elizabeth cultivated her image carefully. She presented herself as the Virgin Queen, married to her kingdom rather than any man. Whether by design or circumstance, her refusal to wed became a political tool, allowing her to place suitors and foreign powers against each other without surrendering authority to a husband. Portraits depicted her resplendent in pearls and silks, symbols of purity and majesty. Ceremonies and progresses through the countryside allowed her subjects to see their monarch in person, binding loyalty with spectacle. In an age when image mattered as much as power, Elizabeth proved a master. Her court became a centre of culture. Playwrights such as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Ben Jonson transformed English drama, filling the stages of London with histories, comedies, and tragedies that captured the complexities of the human condition. Shakespeare's plays alone reflected and reinforced the national mood, dramatising kings and kingdoms in ways that resonated deeply with an audience living through the uncertainties of Elizabeth's rule. Music flourished as well, with composers like Thomas Tallis and William Byrd producing works that blended religious devotion with artistry. For the literate and the listening, it felt like a golden age of culture. Beyond art, the Elizabethan era was marked by exploration and adventure. England, inspired by Spain and Portugal's global empires, began to push outward. Voyagers like Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, returning with treasure seized from Spanish ships and colonies. Sir Walter Raleigh attempted colonization in the Americas, founding the ill-fated Roanoke settlement. While these ventures were often precarious, they signalled England's growing ambition to join the ranks of maritime powers. For the Crown, privateers were both a source of wealth and a useful tool against Spain. For the Spanish, they were pirates, sanctioned by a queen who smiled politely while her captains looted their treasure fleets. Inevitably, the rivalry with Spain escalated into open conflict. Philip II of Spain, once married to Elizabeth's sister Mary, considered Elizabeth illegitimate and her Protestant rule an affront. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587 provided further provocation. Mary, Elizabeth's Catholic cousin and an anointed queen, had long been a figurehead for plots against her. When evidence tied her to a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth, the decision was made. Mary was beheaded, her death removing a threat, but also outraging Catholic Europe. Philip prepared his response. In 1588, the Spanish Armada set sail, a massive fleet intended to escort an invasion force across the Channel. Elizabeth rallied her forces with speeches that became legendary, most famously at Tilbury, where she declared she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. The Armada's defeat owed as much to weather and English seamanship as to divine providence, but it was celebrated as a national triumph. Fire ships broke Spanish formations, storms scattered the fleet, and only a fraction returned home. England had withstood the might of Europe's most powerful monarch, and Elizabeth's reputation as a resolute leader was cemented. For all the grandeur of culture and victory, life for most of Elizabeth's subjects remained difficult. The population, growing after the ravages of plague, strained resources. Harvest failures in the 1590s brought famine to many regions. Poverty was widespread, leading to the first attempts at systematic poor relief. The Elizabethan Poor Laws established parish responsibility for the destitute, an early step toward a social safety net, but one that underscored the persistence of hardship. While the Queen presided over a court glittering with pageantry, villagers across the countryside struggled to make ends meet, and beggars crowded the streets of towns. Elizabeth's later years were less golden than her legend suggests. The cult of Gloriana, the radiant, eternal queen, masked the aging reality. Political tensions increased as her advisors and favourites aged or died. Robert Dudley, her longtime confidant, passed away. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, fell from favour and was executed for rebellion in 1601. Parliament grew more assertive in debates over taxation and succession, though Elizabeth resisted ceding ground. She maintained her image as firmly as ever, but the kingdom felt the strains of prolonged rule without an heir. The question of succession haunted her reign. Elizabeth steadfastly refused to name an heir publicly, perhaps fearing that doing so would invite plots against her. Yet everyone knew that the Stuart line in Scotland offered the most likely solution. James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, was both Protestant enough to satisfy the establishment and descended from Henry VII, giving him a legitimate claim. As Elizabeth's health declined in 1603, the matter became unavoidable. With her death, the Tudor dynasty would end and the crown would pass to a new line. The crown did not pass into chaos. Instead, it slipped north to Scotland, where James VI, the great-grandson of Henry VII, became James I of England. For the first time, the crowns of England and Scotland were united under one monarch, though the kingdoms themselves remained legally distinct. James arrived in London with a reputation as a learned man, fond of hunting, writing, and theological debate. He had survived assassination attempts in Scotland, balanced unruly nobles, and cultivated the idea of kingship as divinely ordained. To the English, weary of succession crises, his arrival seemed a relief. The transition was peaceful, and the new king promised continuity. Yet within a few years, tensions simmered that would define the Stuart century. Religious discord was the most immediate challenge. England's settlement under Elizabeth had left wounds unhealed. Protestants of a more radical persuasion, the Puritans, wanted to strip away lingering Catholic elements from the Church of England. Catholics, marginalised and persecuted, hoped for toleration under a monarch whose mother Mary, Queen of Scots, had died for her Catholic faith. James disappointed both sides. He enforced conformity to the Church of England, alienating Catholics while refusing to go far enough to please Puritans. His efforts at moderation satisfied no one, and resentment festered beneath the surface. That resentment boiled over in 1605 with the Gunpowder Plot. A group of Catholic conspirators, led by Robert Catesby, plotted to blow up Parliament during its opening session, killing the king, his family, and the assembled political elite in one spectacular act. The plan was betrayed before it could be carried out, and Guy Fawkes, discovered guarding barrels of gunpowder in the cellars, became the face of the conspiracy. The plot's failure brought relief but also a wave of anti-Catholic sentiment, cementing suspicion of Catholics for generations. Bonfires and effigies marked the anniversary of the discovery, traditions that lingered long after the immediate danger had passed. James survived, but the plot hardened divisions in a kingdom already struggling to reconcile religious identities. James also struggled with Parliament. He believed in the divine right of kings, that monarchs were accountable only to God, not to earthly assemblies. Parliament, however, had grown accustomed to wielding influence, particularly over taxation. The friction between royal prerogative and parliamentary privilege produced repeated clashes. James's tendency to lavish favours on favourites, such as the flamboyant Duke of Buckingham, did little to endear him to the political nation. Yet for all the quarrels, his reign never tipped into outright crisis. He managed to keep the peace abroad, avoiding costly wars with Spain or France, and at home he presided over a relatively stable kingdom. His son Charles would not be so fortunate. When Charles I ascended the throne in 1625, he inherited both his father's belief in divine right and his political problems, but he lacked James's pragmatism. Charles was dignified, devout, and reserved, but he was also stubborn to the point of blindness. His marriage to the Catholic princess Henrietta Maria of France alarmed Protestant subjects, and his insistence on religious uniformity put him at odds with Puritans. Archbishop William Laud, one of Charles's chief advisers, sought to enforce strict ceremonial practices within the Church of England, which many saw as dangerously close to Catholicism. Resentment flared, particularly in Scotland, where attempts to impose the English prayer book sparked riots and resistance. Parliament, meanwhile, grew increasingly hostile. Charles needed money for military campaigns, particularly against Spain and later France, but he resisted Parliament's scrutiny over how funds were raised and spent. In 1628, Parliament presented him with the Petition of Right, insisting that the king could not levy taxes without parliamentary consent, imprison subjects without cause, or impose martial law arbitrarily. Charles accepted it reluctantly, then ignored its principles. By 1629, he dissolved Parliament altogether and began what became known as the personal rule, 11 years of governing without calling a parliamentary session. During this period, Charles turned to creative methods of raising revenue. He expanded old feudal dues, revived forgotten fines, and most controversially, imposed ship money, a tax traditionally levied on coastal towns for naval defence on the entire kingdom. Legal challenges failed, and while ship money did fill the treasury, it fueled resentment. To many, it symbolised the king's disregard for established rights and his willingness to twist tradition into tyranny. Charles's insistence on his prerogative only deepened the alienation of his subjects. Religious policy compounded the problem. Laud's reforms emphasised ceremony, hierarchy, and order within the church. Altars were railed, vestments emphasised, and preaching curbed. To Puritans, this was a betrayal of Protestant identity, a creeping slide back to Rome. Emigration to the New World increased as families sought freedom to worship according to their conscience. In Scotland, resistance turned to rebellion with the signing of the National Covenant in 1638, a declaration of opposition to Charles's religious impositions. The bishops' wars that followed forced Charles into an awkward corner. He needed money to fight, but without Parliament, his options were limited. By 1640, the financial and political pressures became unbearable. Charles was compelled to summon Parliament, ending his long experiment in personal rule. What followed was a storm of grievances. The Long Parliament, as it came to be known, wasted little time in curbing royal authority, passing measures to limit the king's power and punish his advisers. Laud and the Earl of Strafford, another of Charles's chief counsellors, were impeached and executed. The memory of Magna Carta and the Petition of Right gave Parliament the confidence to press its advantage, while Charles's intransigence ensured compromise would be fleeting. The breaking point came in 1642. Charles, convinced that Parliament's leaders were plotting against him, marched into the chamber with armed guards, intending to arrest 5 members. The men had already fled, and the dramatic display only confirmed fears of royal despotism. Crowds jeered the king as he left London. Trust between monarch and Parliament was shattered beyond repair. Armies began to form, one loyal to Charles, the other to Parliament. England stood on the brink of civil war. By the summer of 1642, the kingdom had polarised. Royalist banners were raised in defence of the king's prerogatives, while parliamentarians rallied under the banner of liberties and law. Neighbours found themselves on opposite sides, families divided, and the kingdom itself split between competing visions of authority. What had begun as disputes over taxation, religion, and prerogative had escalated into open conflict. The Stuart dream of uniting crowns under stable rule now seemed a bitter irony. Instead of unity, England was hurtling toward the bloodiest domestic struggle in its history. When the first shots of the English Civil War rang out in 1642, England was no longer a kingdom disputing policy, but a nation divided against itself. On one side stood the Cavaliers, royalists loyal to Charles I, and the principle of monarchy by divine right. They were often portrayed as dashing noblemen in plumed hats and flowing locks, though in truth many were simply loyal gentry and their tenants. On the other side were the Roundheads, parliamentarians who favoured the authority of Parliament over the king. Their name came from their close-cropped hair, a plain style that contrasted with Cavalier fashion, though they were no less determined for lacking curls. What began as a quarrel between king and Parliament soon became a brutal contest that consumed towns, families, and the very identity of the kingdom. The early years of the war revealed the strength and weakness of both sides. The Cavaliers commanded loyalty in much of the north and west, while Parliament held London and the wealthy southeast, with its ports, trade, and arsenals. Charles I proved a less than brilliant commander, but he retained the support of skilled generals and the prestige of monarchy. Parliament, meanwhile, had resources but lacked cohesion, its commanders often quarrelling and its soldiers initially less disciplined. For ordinary people, the war was catastrophic. Villages were raided by one army, then by the other. Supplies were seized, homes burned, and loyalties questioned. Neutrality was nearly impossible, and even those who avoided battlefields endured the burden of taxation and requisition. As the conflict dragged on, Parliament began to reform its forces. By 1645, under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell and Sir Thomas Fairfax, the new model army was created. This professional, centralised force was drilled, disciplined, and motivated by both pay and Puritan zeal. It proved decisive at the Battle of Nossoby in June 1645, where Charles's army was shattered. The capture of royal baggage, including the king's correspondence, revealed his secret appeals for foreign aid, further undermining his credibility. By 1646, Charles had surrendered, but the war was far from over. Parliament was divided, the Scots demanded influence, and Charles himself proved incapable of compromise. His evasions and intrigues reignited the conflict, leading to a second phase of war in 1648. The Second War ended more decisively. The new model army, now hardened and radicalised, crushed royalist uprisings. Charles, captured again, was no longer seen by his opponents as a misguided king, but as a traitor. In 1649, he was put on trial in Westminster Hall, accused of tyranny and treason against his people. The spectacle was unprecedented. Kings were meant to embody law, not be judged by it. Yet Charles, defiant to the end, insisted he was answerable only to God. His judges disagreed. On January 30th, 1649, he was led to a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. Before a hushed crowd, he declared himself the King of England, not of men's opinions, then laid his head on the block. With one stroke of the axe, monarchy was abolished. England now became a republic, or, as its leaders called it, a Commonwealth. Parliament assumed authority, but real power soon lay in the hands of the new model army and its most formidable figure, Oliver Cromwell. A country gentleman turned soldier, Cromwell had risen through the ranks by sheer competence and conviction. Fiercely Puritan, convinced that he was an instrument of divine providence, Cromwell became the dominant voice in shaping the new regime. His first task was to secure the kingdom, and he did so with ruthless determination. Ireland bore the brunt of his zeal. In 1649, Cromwell led a campaign to crush royalist and Catholic resistance there, culminating in the massacres at Drogheda and Wexford. His actions were remembered with bitterness for centuries, symbols of sectarian cruelty. In Scotland too, he fought campaigns against supporters of Charles's son, who had been proclaimed Charles II by loyalists. Victory at Dunbar in 1650 and Worcester in 1651 secured his dominance. For the first time, England, Scotland and Ireland were brought under a single republican government, though by conquest rather than consensus. Domestically, the Commonwealth attempted to remake society along Puritan lines. Theatres were closed, viewed as dens of immorality. Public festivals were curtailed. Christmas, with its merriment and feasting, was frowned upon as pagan excess. Drinking, gambling and dancing were suppressed. Sunday became a day of strict observance, with fines for those who treated it lightly. To some, this was the godly reformation long desired. To many more, it was joyless tyranny, a grey overlay upon the rhythms of ordinary life. While sermons multiplied and pamphlets poured from the presses, laughter and festivity seemed to vanish from public spaces. Politically, the Commonwealth was unstable. Parliament, divided between moderates and radicals, often found itself at odds with the army. Levellers, a radical movement demanding greater democracy and equality, challenged the leadership, but their uprisings were crushed by Cromwell. When Parliament proved intransigent, Cromwell marched soldiers into the chamber in 1653 and dissolved it, declaring, "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing lately." In its place, he accepted the title of Lord Protector, ruling as a kind of military dictator under the guise of republicanism. As Lord Protector, Cromwell governed with both vision and iron will. He reformed taxation, encouraged trade, and strengthened the navy, laying foundations for England's later maritime empire. The Navigation Acts restricted foreign ships in English trade, fueling tension with the Dutch but boosting English commerce. Abroad, he sought to spread Protestant influence and challenge Catholic Spain, launching campaigns in the Caribbean and Europe. Yet for all his accomplishments, his rule never shed the aura of authoritarianism. He refused the crown when it was offered, but in practice he wielded kingly power without the legitimacy of monarchy. Cromwell's personal faith infused his leadership. He believed England was a chosen nation, tasked with advancing God's will. This conviction gave him resilience, but also rigidity. He tolerated some diversity. Jews were readmitted to England under his rule, but he showed little patience for dissent that threatened his authority. His reliance on the army alienated civilians, and his attempts to divide the country into military districts under major generals only deepened resentment. The Republican experiment, meant to embody liberty and virtue, increasingly looked like rule by the sword. When Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, his carefully built protectorate collapsed almost immediately. His son Richard lacked his father's authority, and the army, parliament, and country at large could not agree on how to govern. Within 2 years, the Republican experiment had unravelled, and the old solution, however flawed, appeared preferable: the monarchy. In 1660, Charles II, son of the executed Charles I, was invited back to take the throne. He returned from exile in France with charm, wit, and a determination to enjoy the pleasures his father's reign had so conspicuously lacked. The Restoration had begun, and England, weary of sermons and soldiers, embraced it with relief. Charles II quickly earned a reputation as the Merry Monarch. His court was lively, colourful, and scandalous, a deliberate contrast to Cromwell's stern Puritanism. Theatres reopened, music flourished, and public entertainments returned. Samuel Pepys's diary, one of the great sources of the age, describes a London buzzing with gossip, plays, and tavern chatter. Charles himself was central to the spectacle. Tall, witty, and charismatic, he surrounded himself with courtiers and mistresses. He fathered no legitimate children with his queen, Catherine of Braganza, but sired numerous illegitimate offspring, acknowledged openly at court. For many, he embodied vitality after years of dour repression. For others, his libertinism underscored a monarchy concerned more with pleasure than with piety. Yet beneath the merriment, serious challenges tested his reign. The Great Plague of 1665 ravaged London, killing tens of thousands and driving many who could flee into the countryside. The following year, the Great Fire swept through the city, destroying thousands of homes and churches, including St. Paul's Cathedral. Out of ashes came renewal. Christopher Wren's designs remade the skyline, but for those who lived through it, the Restoration was anything but stable. War also dogged Charles's reign. Conflict with the Dutch tested England's navy, and tensions with Catholic France complicated alliances. Abroad as at home, Charles steered a careful, often opportunistic course, seeking to strengthen royal power while avoiding outright confrontation with Parliament. Religion remained the most divisive issue. The Restoration re-established the Church of England and marginalised nonconformists, but suspicion of Catholicism lingered. Charles himself leaned privately toward Catholic sympathies, a fact that worried his Protestant subjects. The Test Act of 1673 barred Catholics from holding public office, reflecting deep mistrust. When Charles's brother and heir, James, Duke of York, openly declared his Catholic faith, alarm spread. The prospect of a Catholic monarch was unacceptable to many in a kingdom that defined itself against papal authority. Rumours of popish plots, real or imagined, circulated, feeding paranoia. Parliament oscillated between cooperation and confrontation, reflecting the uneasy balance of power that had emerged since the Civil War. Charles managed to maintain his throne through a mixture of charm, political skill, and sheer luck. He dissolved troublesome parliaments, relied on French subsidies to avoid dependence on domestic taxation, and cultivated the loyalty of enough nobles to weather crises. When he died in 1685, he had restored monarchy as an institution, but he had not resolved the central question. What would happen if the crown fell to a Catholic king? His brother James II provided the answer, and it nearly undid the Stuart dynasty altogether. James II ascended the throne with little of his brother's charisma and none of his caution. He was brave in battle and loyal to those he trusted, but he was also rigid, authoritarian, and convinced that his Catholic faith was integral to his kingship. At first, some Protestants hoped he might govern with restraint. That hope evaporated quickly. James appointed Catholics to high office, dismissed the Test Acts, and promoted toleration for Catholics and dissenting Protestants alike through his Declaration of Indulgence. While modern ears might hear this as religious freedom, in the 17th century it sounded like royal overreach and a slippery slope toward Catholic dominance. James's most fateful mistake was the birth of a son in 1688. Until then, his Protestant daughters Mary and Anne stood next in line, and many hoped the Catholic king was merely a temporary interlude. But a Catholic heir promised a dynasty. Whispers of a warming pan baby, smuggled into the Queen's chamber to fake an heir, reflected both suspicion and desperation. For the Protestant political nation, the prospect of a Catholic succession was intolerable. Leading nobles turned to Mary, James's daughter, married to the staunchly Protestant William of Orange, Stadtholder of the Netherlands. They invited William to intervene, an extraordinary move that amounted to inviting foreign invasion in the name of liberty. In November 1688, William landed at Torbay with an army, greeted not with resistance, but with widespread support. James's forces melted away, and his most trusted officers deserted him. Even his daughter Anne defected to William's side. Faced with abandonment and despair, James fled to France, where he lived the rest of his life, in exile under Louis XIV's protection. England had undergone what would be called the Glorious Revolution. Glorious not because it was bloodless, it had skirmishes and violence, but because it replaced one monarch with another, without the prolonged agony of civil war. In 1689, Parliament offered the crown jointly to William and Mary, but on new terms. The Bill of Rights, passed the same year, limited royal authority in ways that echoed the lessons of Magna Carta and the Petition of Right. The monarch could not suspend laws or levy taxes without parliamentary consent. Standing armies in peacetime required approval, and subjects were guaranteed certain rights. For lawyers and politicians it was a landmark. For peasants and labourers, daily life changed little, but the principle was clear. Monarchy survived, but only under the watchful eye of Parliament. The Glorious Revolution cemented a new balance of power. The Stuarts continued, but their authority was curtailed. Parliament, once a body summoned at the king's pleasure, now stood as a permanent and central institution in governance. Political parties began to emerge, Whigs and Tories arguing in ways that would shape modern politics. The divine right of kings, championed by James I and Charles I, was dead in practice, if not in rhetoric. England was not a republic, but it was no longer an absolute monarchy either. The Revolution had not only removed a king, but had redefined kingship itself. By the end of the 17th century, England was still a monarchy, but a monarchy reshaped by hard lessons. Civil war, regicide, dictatorship, and religious strife had left scars too deep to ignore. The Restoration had brought back ceremony and pageantry, but the Glorious Revolution ensured that crowns would be worn under conditions set by Parliament. The king might reign, but the laws of the kingdom now flowed through a wider channel. It was a compromise that allowed monarchy to endure where it had fallen elsewhere in Europe. For England, it marked the beginning of a new political order, one in which Parliament ruled and kings merely survived within its boundaries. In 1714, Queen Anne died without surviving children, and the Stuart line ended. The crown passed according to the Act of Settlement to the nearest Protestant heirs. That meant skipping over dozens of closer Catholic claimants and landing on a relatively obscure German prince, George, Elector of Hanover. George I spoke little English, was more comfortable hunting in the German forests than addressing Parliament, and seemed an unlikely figure to inspire loyalty. Yet his accession marked the start of the Georgian era, a century that would see Britain transformed by politics, drink, literature, and the first stirrings of industry and empire. If the Tudors and Stuarts had fought over kingship, the Georgians would preside over a kingdom increasingly run by ministers, coffee houses, and the invisible hand of commerce. The Hanoverians arrived with shaky legitimacy. Jacobite supporters of the exiled Stuart line rose in rebellion, most dramatically in 1715 and again in 1745, when Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, marched into England with hopes of reclaiming the throne. Both uprisings failed, but they revealed how contested the Hanoverian dynasty was in its early decades. George I and his son George II leaned heavily on ministers and generals to secure their reigns. Robert Walpole, often styled Britain's first Prime Minister, emerged during this period, presiding over a long and stable administration that reflected a shift in power. The monarch reigned, but the machinery of government increasingly depended on Parliament and professional politicians. The Revolution settlement of 1689 had clipped royal wings, and the Hanoverians had little choice but to accept the new balance. While politics moved toward parliaments and cabinets, ordinary life buzzed with new habits. Coffee houses flourished as centres of conversation, gossip, and debate. They were known as Penny University, where for the price of a drink one could sit for hours, reading newspapers, exchanging news, and discussing everything from trade to philosophy. Merchants struck deals there, writers found audiences, and political factions spread pamphlets. Alongside coffee came gin, cheap and potent, beloved of the urban poor. The gin craze of the early 18th century alarmed moralists and magistrates alike, who saw entire neighbourhoods dissolving into drunken stupor. William Hogarth's engravings, contrasting Gin Lane with Beer Street, captured the panic. Gin was ruin, beer was stability. Attempts to regulate the trade met resistance, but the image of Londoners drinking themselves into oblivion became a defining stereotype of the era. Despite gin-soaked alleyways, the Georgian period was also one of cultural flowering. Writers like Jonathan Swift wielded satire as a weapon, skewering politics, religion, and human folly with biting wit. His Gulliver's Travels took readers to fantastical lands, only to reveal the absurdities of their own society reflected back at them. Alexander Pope crafted poetry of elegance and precision, while Samuel Johnson produced the monumental Dictionary of the English Language in 1755, a work that both codified and celebrated English. Johnson himself became a central figure of literary London, presiding over conversations in taverns and coffee houses, where wit and erudition flowed as freely as the punch bowl. Around him gathered figures like James Boswell, who immortalised Johnson in biography, and Oliver Goldsmith, who chronicled both rural nostalgia and urban satire. The theatre thrived too, with actors like David Garrick bringing Shakespeare to new prominence. Paintings by artists such as William Hogarth and Thomas Gainsborough captured both social critique and aristocratic elegance. Music found patrons in Handel, whose compositions filled Georgian churches and concert halls. It was an age when culture was not confined to courts, but shared in clubs, coffee houses, and increasingly in print, as literacy spread and newspapers multiplied. The public sphere, as historians later called it, was being born, a world where opinion could be formed and contested beyond the walls of Parliament. Economically, the Georgian age was marked by expansion. Trade networks stretched across the Atlantic and into Asia, bringing sugar, tobacco, tea and spices into British homes. The triangular trade of goods, slaves and raw materials enriched merchants and financed new ventures, though at a human cost that was staggering. The profits of slavery built country houses and endowed institutions, even as the enslaved laboured in brutal conditions on Caribbean plantations. Within England, industry stirred. The beginnings of mechanisation, from textile mills to steam engines, hinted at the transformations to come. Canals were dug, linking towns and markets, while improved agricultural practices fed a growing population. The countryside shifted from subsistence to surplus, and the economy began to pulse with new energy. At the same time, Britain's cities swelled. London grew into the largest city in Europe, teeming with merchants, labourers, aristocrats, and beggars. Coffee houses clustered around the exchange, taverns lined the streets, and theatres drew crowds nightly. But growth brought problems. Crime, poverty, and disease remained constant threats. The Bow Street Runners, often called London's first police force, emerged to impose some semblance of order. Public executions at Tyburn drew thousands, both a warning and a grim form of entertainment. The Georgian city was vibrant, noisy, and often squalid, a place of opportunity and anxiety in equal measure. Politics in the Georgian era reflected both stability and division. Whigs and Tories crystallised into recognisable parties, battling in Parliament and in print. Patronage determined much of government. Seats were bought, boroughs controlled by wealthy landowners, but the system nevertheless produced continuity. Walpole's long ministry from 1721 to 1742 demonstrated how effective stable government could be at avoiding crises, even if critics derided him as corrupt. Later governments wrestled with similar issues, balancing royal influence, party rivalries, and the demands of empire. The monarchy receded further from daily governance, though George III, who came to the throne in 1760, would attempt to reassert royal influence with mixed results. Religion too shifted during the Georgian period. The Church of England remained established, but dissenting groups grew in number and influence. Methodism, spearheaded by John and Charles Wesley, attracted followers with its emphasis on personal faith, revival meetings, and hymns. Its spread reflected the hunger for spirituality outside the formal confines of Anglican worship. At the same time, the Enlightenment encouraged rational inquiry and skepticism. Thinkers debated science, politics, and human nature, often in those same coffee houses where newspapers were read and wagers placed. The Georgian mind balanced reason with revival, satire with sermon, gin with prayer. War, however, was never far away. By the mid-18th century, Britain had grown used to war. The kingdom's politics were often fractious, its economy prone to boom and bust, and its streets filled with gin drinkers and pamphleteers. But nothing focused attention quite like a continental or colonial conflict. War had become a means of projecting power and securing trade, and in the process Britain discovered that its fortunes were tied less to farmland in Europe and more to the oceans and territories beyond. The 18th century would see Britain fight, win and lose on a scale unmatched before, transforming the island into both a global empire and a nation haunted by its own contradictions. The first great conflict of the era was the 7 Years' War, which broke out in 1756. Though ostensibly a European struggle between Prussia and Austria, it rapidly became the first true world war, with battles fought across North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. Britain, allied with Prussia, found itself locked in combat with France and its allies. In Europe, British troops supported Frederick the Great of Prussia, but the real drama unfolded overseas. The Royal Navy secured supremacy at sea, allowing Britain to strike at French colonies and shipping. North America became a central theatre, where what Americans call the French and Indian War was part of this wider struggle. In North America, British forces, bolstered by colonial militias, fought to drive France from its vast holdings in Canada and the Ohio Valley. Early campaigns were disastrous, but leadership improved under William Pitt the Elder, who poured resources into the war. Victories at Louisbourg and Quebec turned the tide. In 1759, General Wolfe's capture of Quebec, though he himself died in the battle, marked a decisive moment. France's colonial empire in North America collapsed, leaving Britain dominant. In India, too, British fortunes rose. Robert Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 established the East India Company as a territorial power, beginning a century of British dominance on the subcontinent. The 7 Years' War ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which confirmed Britain's new global position. Canada, Florida, and vast territories in India were ceded or secured. The Royal Navy had demonstrated its supremacy, and merchants back in London toasted Britain as the world's preeminent empire. Yet victory came at a cost. The war had been ruinously expensive, leaving Britain heavily indebted. To recoup losses, Parliament looked for new sources of revenue, particularly from its increasingly wealthy American colonies. This decision would trigger a conflict as significant as the war itself. The American Revolution began not with cannons but with taxes. Measures such as the Stamp Act of 1765 and the Tea Act of 1773, intended to raise funds, met fierce resistance. Colonists insisted on no taxation without representation, arguing that Parliament had no right to levy taxes on those who had no voice in its chambers. Protests escalated into boycotts, then into open confrontation. By 1775, skirmishes at Lexington and Concord ignited full-scale rebellion. Britain, confident in its military superiority, assumed the uprising could be suppressed quickly. Instead, it spiraled into an 8-year war that stretched Britain's resources and credibility. The early years saw British victories, including the capture of New York and Philadelphia. Yet the sheer size of the colonies and the resilience of the Continental Army under George Washington wore down imperial confidence. The entry of France in 1778, followed by Spain and the Dutch, transformed the rebellion into a global conflict. The Royal Navy, so dominant in the 7 Years' War, now faced multiple enemies. The decisive blow came at Yorktown in 1781, where a combined Franco-American force trapped the British Army and forced surrender. By 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the independence of the United States. Britain had lost its 13 colonies, a humiliating reversal for an empire that had boasted of global supremacy only 2 decades earlier. Yet if America was lost, Britain's imperial fortunes were not undone. Trade routes shifted to the Caribbean, India, and beyond. The sugar islands of the West Indies remained immensely profitable, their wealth built on enslaved labour. In India, the East India Company tightened its grip, administering vast territories and revenues. The Royal Navy, though tested, emerged from the struggle still formidable, patrolling the world's oceans and safeguarding commerce. Britain's global reach endured, though the sting of American independence lingered in political debates and national pride. Domestically, the loss of the colonies sparked soul-searching, but also reform. Figures like Edmund Burke reflected on the dangers of imperial overreach, while others focused on strengthening the economy at home. The late 18th century also saw Britain grappling with the moral and economic contradictions of the slave trade. The abolitionist movement, spearheaded by figures like William Wilberforce, gained momentum, challenging the foundations of the very system that enriched the empire. The debates revealed a society torn between profit and principle, even as it prepared for new challenges abroad. No sooner had Britain adjusted to the loss of America than the French Revolution erupted in 1789, reshaping Europe's political landscape. At first, many in Britain greeted it with cautious sympathy, seeing echoes of their own glorious revolution. But as the revolution radicalised, executing Louis XVI and unleashing war across the continent, sympathy turned to alarm. Britain entered into conflict with revolutionary France in 1793, initiating what would become a generation-long struggle. The wars of the French Revolution tested Britain's endurance, drawing on its navy, finances, and manpower. The looming presence of Napoleon Bonaparte transformed this conflict into something larger still. Rising from obscure artillery officer to general, then consul, and finally emperor, Napoleon embodied the dynamism and threat of revolutionary France. His ambitions extended across Europe and beyond, challenging every established power. For Britain, the rivalry was existential. Its naval supremacy, secured at battles like Trafalgar in 1805, would be the shield of the nation, while on land its forces supported coalitions of continental allies. The wars promised to be long, expensive, and transformative. By the dawn of the 19th century, Britain was both wealthy and anxious. The 7 Years' War had given it global reach. The American Revolution had humbled its confidence, and the Revolutionary Wars now demanded everything the kingdom could muster. The Royal Navy commanded the seas, trade continued to enrich merchants, and industrial changes were beginning to reshape the economy. Yet the costs of endless war mounted, and the challenge of Napoleon loomed over Europe. The Georgians had built prosperity and empire, but they had also entangled Britain in conflicts that would define its fate for decades. The 18th century ended not with peace but with drums beating, ships sailing, and the nation steeling itself for the greatest struggle yet. When Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, she was just 18, small in stature but determined to embody her role. After the excesses and scandals of the Hanoverian kings, the public longed for dignity in monarchy, and the young queen offered it. Her reign would stretch for 64 years, the longest in British history at that point, and become synonymous with an age. The Victorian period was one of dizzying contradictions: industrial power and urban poverty, empire and anxiety, science and superstition, moral earnestness and private vice. It was a century when Britain seemed to bestride the globe, yet struggled constantly with the consequences of its own transformation. The Industrial Revolution had been building for decades, but under Victoria, it accelerated at an unprecedented pace. Railways shrank the island, their iron tracks linking cities and towns, making travel quicker than any generation before could imagine. Steam engines powered factories, churning out cotton, steel, and coal in quantities that transformed not only Britain, but the world. Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool became bywords for industrial might, while London swelled into the largest city in Europe. But prosperity was not evenly shared. The same forces that made mill owners wealthy consigned countless workers to endless hours in dim, dangerous factories. Children crawled under looms, women stitched in sweatshops, and men mined coal in pits where the air itself seemed to burn. Dickens's novels captured these realities, turning poverty and injustice into literature that wealthy Victorians could read by gaslight in their parlours. If factories and railways represented industrial power, the Great Exhibition of 1851 symbolised Victorian pride. Held in the glittering Crystal Palace, it displayed machines, textiles, and inventions from across Britain and its empire. Millions visited, marvelling at locomotives, printing presses, and goods from colonies overseas. The exhibition presented Britain as the world's workshop, confident in its progress and modernity. Yet outside the glass walls, Londoners lived in overcrowded tenements. Sanitation was rudimentary, and cholera lurked in contaminated water. The Crystal Palace dazzled, but it also embodied the central contradiction of Victorian life, triumph resting on a foundation of misery. Empire expanded relentlessly in these decades. India, long managed by the East India Company, was brought under direct crown rule after the rebellion of 1857, which exposed the fragility of imperial control. The jewel in the crown became a central symbol of Victorian power, its resources and labour enriching Britain while its people endured subjugation. Africa, too, was partitioned as European powers carved up the continent, with Britain taking swathes from the Cape to Cairo. The Royal Navy policed trade routes, enforced imperial order, and ensured that goods from sugar to tea flowed into British markets. For Victorians, empire was both pride and destiny, proof that they led the world. For those under British rule, it often meant exploitation, cultural erasure, and violence. At home, reformers struggled to mitigate the harsh realities of industrial life. Public health became a central concern after cholera outbreaks swept through cities in the 1830s and 1840s. Edwin Chadwick's report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population revealed the appalling state of urban life. Open sewers, contaminated wells, and overcrowded slums. Joseph Bazalgette's grand sewer system in London, completed after the Great Stink of 1858 made Parliament itself nearly uninhabitable, finally provided relief. The project was both practical and symbolic, engineering and science marshalled to save lives and restore order. Yet while sewers flowed under London, poverty still choked its alleys above. Reform extended into labour laws. The Factory Acts limited the hours children could work, gradually reducing their presence in factories. Later acts restricted working hours for women and improved safety standards, though enforcement was patchy. Trade unions gained legal recognition in 1871, giving workers new tools to press for rights. The working class movement that had fueled Chartism earlier in the century had not succeeded in its demands for universal suffrage, but its legacy lingered. Step by step, the political system expanded. The Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1884 widened the electorate, granting more men the vote, though women remained excluded. Each change was cautious, a compromise designed to stave off revolution rather than embrace democracy outright. Compared to the upheavals on the continent, Britain's reforms looked gradual, but they were no less transformative. Science reshaped the intellectual landscape. Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, challenged fundamental beliefs about creation. The theory of evolution through natural selection suggested that life develops not through divine fiat, but through slow, indifferent processes. The controversy was immense. Sermons denounced Darwin as undermining morality. Caricatures depicted him with the body of an ape. Yet his ideas took root, influencing not only biology, but wider debates about humanity's place in the universe. Geology, chemistry, and medicine advanced alongside, bringing both progress and anxiety. For Victorians, the certainty of faith collided with the uncertainty of science, leaving many in a state of uneasy coexistence between Sunday piety and weekday skepticism. Paradoxically, as science advanced, superstition thrived. Seances, spiritualism, and ghost stories captured imaginations, even among the educated elite. The Victorians, with their gas lamps and microscopes, also peered into crystal balls. This blend of rationality and mysticism reflected the tensions of an age caught between past and future. For every Darwinian debate in a lecture hall, there was a gathering in a darkened parlour where spirits were summoned and tables wrapped mysteriously in the gloom. Women's roles reflected similar contradictions. On the one hand, the ideal of the angel in the house confined middle-class women to domesticity, their virtue tied to modesty and marriage. On the other hand, women became increasingly visible in public life. Florence Nightingale redefined nursing and public health during the Crimean War. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson became the first woman to qualify as a physician in Britain. The suffrage movement gained momentum in the later decades of the century, with figures like Millicent Fawcett pressing for political rights. The struggle would not be won until the next century, but the seeds of change were firmly planted in the Victorian soil. Culturally, the age produced towering figures. Dickens chronicled urban poverty and moral hypocrisy. The Bronte sisters explored passion and constraint in provincial settings. George Eliot probed psychology and morality in her novels. Alfred Lord Tennyson, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Gerard Manley Hopkins enriched poetry, while art and architecture reflected both Gothic revival and industrial innovation. Music, too, flourished, though the Victorians were as likely to hum a hymn as an operatic aria. Literature and art not only entertained, but also critiqued, holding a mirror to society's successes and failures. Politically, the age was dominated by figures such as Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone, whose rivalry defined late Victorian politics. Disraeli championed empire and conservatism with flair, while Gladstone embodied reforming liberalism. Both wrestled with the contradictions of the age: how to maintain imperial authority while addressing social reform, how to expand democracy without unleashing instability, how to reconcile moral earnestness with the realities of industrial capitalism. Their debates, carried out in Parliament and the press, shaped policy, but also revealed the difficulty of governing a society in rapid flux. For ordinary people, life was a mixture of opportunity and hardship. The expansion of railways and education opened horizons, but poverty remained entrenched. The poor law system persisted, stigmatizing those forced into workhouses. Respectability was prized, but crime, prostitution, and alcoholism thrived in the shadows of progress. Jack the Ripper's murders in the 1880s horrified London, exposing both the vulnerability of women in poverty and the fascination of a society with crime and scandal. The Victorian age prided itself on morality, but it lived with constant reminders of its failures. By the end of Victoria's reign, Britain was the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth. Its empire spanned continents, its industries dominated markets, and its navy ruled the seas. London was the financial capital of the world, its banks and exchanges linking markets across oceans. Yet beneath the confidence lay fissures. Ireland remained restless under British rule, demanding home rule. The working classes pressed for deeper reforms, women for suffrage, and colonies for recognition. A broad imperial competition sharpened as Germany and the United States rose to challenge Britain's supremacy. The Victorian age, for all its confidence, had built prosperity on fragile foundations. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, her long shadow lifted from the monarchy, and her son Edward VII finally ascended the throne at the age of 59. After decades as Prince of Wales, dismissed by his mother as frivolous and unreliable, Edward surprised many by proving an effective, if unconventional, king. His reign ushered in what became known as the Edwardian era, remembered for its gilded surface, optimism, and elegance. Compared to Victoria's mourning, black and strict morality, Edward's court glittered with colour, sociability, and cosmopolitan flair. Balls, races, and dinners filled the social calendar, and the king himself embodied indulgence, fond of fine clothes, food, and travel. To the public, the Edwardian years seemed golden, an age of prosperity before the storm, though beneath the surface cracks were already widening. This gilded optimism extended across society. The upper classes flourished in a world of country houses, servants, and rigid etiquette. Aristocrats hosted weekend parties where shooting, dining, and gossip filled the hours. London was a hub of luxury, from grand hotels like the Ritz to fashionable restaurants where the wealthy mingled. The arts thrived as well, with new theatres, music halls, and exhibitions offering entertainment and spectacle. The period style, elegant fashions, ornate architecture, and elaborate social rituals reinforced the sense that Britain had entered a new age, confident and outward-looking. Yet this lifestyle represented only a fraction of the population. For the majority, life remained far more precarious, and the apparent stability masked ongoing tensions. Technology symbolised the age's confidence. Motor cars, though still a novelty, began appearing on roads, heralding the transformation of travel. Telephones connected households and businesses, though only the affluent could afford them. The skyline of London changed with the advent of electric lighting, while cinema began to flicker in small halls, offering moving pictures that fascinated audiences. The launch of great ships captured imaginations, none more famous than the Titanic, whose sinking in 1912 became both a tragedy and a metaphor for Edwardian overconfidence. Airplanes, fragile and experimental, demonstrated that even the sky might soon be conquered. To live in Edwardian Britain was to feel that progress was accelerating, carrying society into a dazzling modern age. But alongside luxury and innovation came unrest. The suffragette movement grew increasingly visible, demanding the vote for women with persistence and, at times, militancy. Organisations like the Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, staged protests, hunger strikes, and acts of civil disobedience. Suffragettes chained themselves to railings, disrupted public meetings, and endured brutal treatment in prison. Newspapers debated their cause while politicians struggled to balance sympathy with resistance. For Edwardian society, the sight of respectable women smashing windows or marching in the streets was both shocking and unavoidable, a sign that the old order was being challenged. Workers, too, pressed their demands more forcefully. Trade unions expanded, organising strikes in industries from mining to transport. The Labour Party, founded at the turn of the century, gave political voice to the working class, pushing issues of wages, housing, and representation onto the national agenda. In 1906, the Liberals returned to power and launched a series of reforms, introducing free school meals, old age pensions, and labour protections. These measures, modest by modern standards, marked a shift toward the welfare state. Yet inequality remained stark. While the aristocracy enjoyed Edwardian splendour, families in industrial towns still lived in cramped conditions, their lives governed by the rhythms of factory whistles and uncertain employment. Social divides were etched not only by class but by empire. Britain remained the world's foremost imperial power, its possessions spanning continents. The Edwardian years witnessed both the height of imperial confidence and the stirrings of discontent. The Boer War, 1899 to 1902, fought in South Africa, revealed the costs of empire. Though Britain ultimately triumphed, the war exposed military inefficiency and the brutality of concentration camps used against Boer civilians. At home, critics questioned the morality of imperial conquest, even as the majority continued to celebrate imperial might. Schoolchildren recited maps painted red, while soldiers and administrators extended Britain's reach abroad. For many, empire was still destiny, but the seeds of anti-colonial resistance had already been planted. Culturally, the Edwardians balanced tradition with modernity. Literature reflected the era's uncertainties. E. M. Forster explored social conventions in Howard's End, while H. G. Wells imagined futures shaped by technology and science. Theatre entertained with both comedy and critique, while music halls offered popular songs and variety acts for mass audiences. Art Nouveau influenced design and architecture, its flowing lines visible in everything from furniture to advertisements. The Edwardian world seemed vibrant and stylish, yet also restless, caught between Victorian solidity and modern upheaval. Edward VII himself embodied the contradictions of the era. His reputation as a pleasure-loving monarch did not prevent him from serving effectively as a diplomat. He cultivated relationships with European leaders, smoothing tensions with France in what became known as the Entente Cordiale of 1904. His personal charm helped ease international rivalries, though he could not erase the larger forces pushing Europe toward conflict. When he died in 1910, mourners across the nation and empire grieved sincerely, but the stability of his reign was already fading. His son George V inherited a kingdom more anxious and less secure than the one Edward had briefly rejuvenated. As the decade advanced, tension mounted. Industrial unrest intensified with mass strikes in 1911 and 1912. Irish politics reached crisis as debates over home rule threatened to split the kingdom. Suffragettes grew more militant, setting fires and smashing shop windows in frustration at government inaction. Internationally, rivalries sharpened. Germany's rise as an industrial and naval power alarmed Britain, whose Royal Navy had long been its shield. The arms race accelerated, with dreadnought battleships sliding from shipyards in both nations. In the Balkans, nationalist tensions and great power rivalries created flashpoints that threatened to ignite wider conflict. By 1914, the Edwardian dream of gilded stability looked fragile. The elegance of drawing rooms and the optimism of new technologies masked deeper fractures. Class conflict, women's suffrage battles, Irish division, and imperial uncertainty. Yet many still believed peace and progress would continue. Britain seemed wealthy, modern, and powerful, its empire vast, its navy unmatched. Few imagined that the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo could trigger a war that would engulf the continent. Europe, lulled by decades of uneasy peace, was sleepwalking toward catastrophe. The Edwardian age, remembered nostalgically for its elegance, was in truth the calm before the storm. When Britain entered the Great War in August 1914, few imagined the scale of the catastrophe to come. Crowds cheered as soldiers marched through London, convinced the war would be over by Christmas. Patriotism filled the air, and posters promised glory and adventure to young men who signed up in droves. Across the empire, from Canada to India, volunteers joined the cause. Yet by the end of that year, the reality of modern war had set in. The Western Front, stretching from the Channel to Switzerland, had become a landscape of trenches, barbed wire, and mud. The old vision of cavalry charges and quick victories was swept away by machine guns, artillery, and stalemate. England had entered a war unlike any in its history. The trenches defined the experience of the war for millions. Dug deep into the soil of France and Belgium, they became home to soldiers for months on end. Conditions were appalling. Mud swallowed boots, rats scurried among the bodies of the dead, and lice tormented men who could never truly wash. The constant threat of shell fire made even the smallest task dangerous. Going over the top into no man's land meant facing machine guns that cut down ranks in seconds. Soldiers wrote home about the mud, the stench and the monotony, punctuated by moments of terror. The war was not a matter of gallant manoeuvres, but of attrition, grinding down armies until something or someone broke. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 became emblematic of the war's futility. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, the heaviest in its history. Whole communities in England were devastated as PALS battalions, units of friends and neighbours who had enlisted together, were wiped out in a single morning. The offensive dragged on for months, gaining only a few miles of ground at enormous cost. For the public back home, the names of places like the Somme, Ypres and Passchendaele became shorthand for slaughter. Optimism faded, replaced by grim endurance. The psychological toll was immense. Shell shock, the term used at the time, described men broken by the constant bombardment and stress. Some trembled uncontrollably, others were unable to speak, and many were haunted by nightmares long after they left the front. Understanding of trauma was limited, and some sufferers were accused of cowardice rather than treated with compassion. The war scarred not only bodies but minds, leaving a generation marked by experiences they could scarcely describe to those who had not lived them. At home, the war reshaped society. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, producing munitions and filling roles left vacant by men. Canary girls, so named because chemicals in the shells turned their skin yellow, risked their lives daily in dangerous work, rationing altered diets while air raids brought the war to London and other cities. The government expanded its power, controlling industries, imposing conscription, and censoring information. Patriotism remained strong, but dissent also grew, with conscientious objectors and critics facing hostility. The war touched every household, whether through absence, hunger, or grief. The empire too was tested. Troops from across the world fought under the Union Jack. Canadians distinguished themselves at Vimy Ridge, Australians and New Zealanders at Gallipoli, and Indian soldiers endured the same mud and shells as their British counterparts on the Western Front. Yet participation also fostered new questions. If colonial subjects could die for Britain, should they not also have a greater say in their own futures? The war sowed seeds of nationalism across the empire, even as it demonstrated its military value. Technology escalated the conflict in ways unimaginable to earlier generations. Tanks first appeared on the battlefield, lumbering and unreliable, but terrifying to those who faced them. Poison gas from chlorine to mustard inflicted agonizing injuries and spread fear among the trenches. Aircraft, once fragile curiosities, became tools for reconnaissance and bombing. The war blurred the lines between industrial production and combat, with factories at home as vital as soldiers at the front. It was total war, requiring the mobilization of entire societies. Despite the suffering, moments of humanity emerged. The Christmas truce of 1914 saw soldiers briefly leave their trenches, exchange gifts, and even play football in no man's land. Such episodes were rare, quickly suppressed by commanders who feared fraternization, but they revealed the shared misery of men on both sides. Ordinary soldiers often recognized in each other not enemies, but fellow victims of a war driven by political decisions far beyond their control. By 1917, the strain was unbearable. Russia collapsed into revolution, and the United States entered the war, tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. American troops and resources bolstered weary armies. The German spring offensives of 1918 nearly broke the Allied lines, but counterattacks pushed them back. The 100 Days Offensive drove the Central Powers into retreat. On November 11th, 1918, at the 11th hour, the guns finally fell silent. Bells rang out in England, crowds cheered, and relief washed over the nation. The war was over, but victory came with little joy. The cost was staggering. Nearly 1 million British soldiers were dead, with countless more wounded physically or psychologically. Whole villages had lost their young men, leaving gaps in communities that would never be filled. Memorials sprang up across the country, solemn reminders of sacrifice and absence. The empire, though victorious, was shaken. Britain remained a global power, but its confidence was tempered by exhaustion. The war had consumed resources, lives, and faith in the certainty of progress. The world of 1918 was not the same as that of 1914, and the belief in inevitable advancement that had characterized the Edwardian years was gone. For England, the Great War was both triumph and tragedy. It ended with victory, but also with a generation lost and a society permanently scarred. The trenches, the Somme, and the shell-shocked faces of survivors haunted the nation. Modern warfare had revealed its true nature. Not noble charges, but mud, machines, and endless slaughter. The war had reshaped Britain's place in the world and shattered illusions of invulnerability. In 1919, as the country counted its dead and tried to rebuild, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The interwar years were marked by economic hardship, the rise of dictators on the continent, and a widespread desire to avoid another catastrophe. Appeasement became the strategy of choice, particularly under Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Hitler's annexations in Austria and Czechoslovakia were met with concessions, Chamberlain returning from Munich in 1938, proclaiming, "Peace for our time." It was a phrase that would age poorly. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain declared war. The long-dreaded Second Conflict had arrived. The opening months of the war, sometimes called the Phony War, saw little fighting on the Western Front, but the illusion of calm ended abruptly in 1940. Germany swept through Norway, Denmark, Belgium and France with alarming speed. The British Expeditionary Force, sent to aid the French, was caught in retreat. In May and June 1940, hundreds of thousands of British and Allied soldiers were trapped at Dunkirk. Only a desperate evacuation, using warships and an improvised fleet of civilian boats, brought them home. Dunkirk was no victory, but it was a miracle of survival. The army escaped, battered and without its equipment, but intact enough to fight another day. Britain now stood alone against Hitler, with invasion a constant threat. In this moment of peril, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. His rhetoric, blending defiance with grim realism, rallied the nation. He promised not easy triumph, but blood, toil, tears and sweat. His speeches, declaring Britain would fight on the beaches and never surrender, became touchstones of resolve. Yet words alone could not stop bombs. In September 1940, the Blitz began. German aircraft pounded London and other cities night after night. The aim was to break morale and cripple industry. Civilians huddled in underground stations, emerging in the morning to find streets reduced to rubble. Fires blazed, glass shattered, and homes disappeared, yet life continued. Buses still ran, factories still produced, and Londoners still queued for tea amid ruins. The Blitz killed tens of thousands and displaced many more, but it did not shatter the will of the population. Instead, it forged a narrative of resilience. The Blitz spirit, celebrated in photographs of milkmen delivering amid wreckage and children wearing gas masks to school. It was not all stoicism. Fear, exhaustion, and grief were everywhere, but survival itself became a form of victory. The Luftwaffe's failure to destroy the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain ensured that invasion was postponed, then abandoned. The island endured, battered but defiant. Beyond the bombing, the war reshaped everyday life. Rationing limited diets, queues stretched outside shops, and blackout curtains darkened streets. Women filled roles in factories, on farms, and in civil defence, just as they had in the previous war. The Women's Land Army worked fields to keep food on tables, while thousands served in auxiliary branches of the armed forces. The war blurred boundaries between front and home, making everyone a participant. Posters urged citizens to keep calm and carry on, though most ignored that slogan at the time, preferring practical advice about salvage and air raid precautions. Britain's empire was once again drawn into the struggle. Troops from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand fought in theatres from North Africa to Burma. The empire supplied vital manpower and resources, but the strain was immense. The fall of Singapore to Japan in 1942, described by Churchill as the worst disaster in British military history, shattered the myth of imperial invincibility. Colonial soldiers fought bravely, but the war exposed the fragility of Britain's ability to hold far-flung territories. Independence movements, already stirring, would find new confidence in the war's aftermath. Militarily, the tide turned slowly. North Africa became the testing ground, with victory at El Alamein in 1942 halting the German advance. The invasion of Italy in 1943 opened a new front, though it proved grinding and slow. Most decisive was the D-Day landings in June 1944, when Allied forces crossed the Channel and began the liberation of France. British, Canadian, and American troops stormed beaches under heavy fire, establishing the bridgehead that would lead to Germany's defeat. For Britain, it was a moment of vindication. After years of endurance, the nation was part of the decisive push back into Europe. On the home front, war meant both solidarity and strain. The government expanded its role dramatically, controlling production, directing labour, and managing information. Censorship shaped what people read in newspapers, while propaganda films bolstered morale. Yet despite hardship, there were moments of levity. Dance halls operated, cinemas showed films, and couples courted in the shadow of war. Life went on, a mixture of normalcy and anxiety, punctuated by air raid sirens and telegrams delivering dreaded news. By the war's end, the social fabric had shifted. The experience of shared sacrifice deepened calls for post-war reform, though those belong to the next chapter. By May 1945, victory in Europe was achieved. Crowds flooded the streets on VE Day, cheering Churchill as he waved from balconies, singing, dancing, and revelling in relief. The war that had begun with Dunkirk and the Blitz ended in triumph, but it was triumph shadowed by loss. More than 450,000 Britons had died, cities were scarred, and resources drained. Britain emerged victorious but diminished. The empire, though it had contributed mightily to the war effort, was visibly cracking. India's demand for independence was unstoppable. Nationalist movements elsewhere would soon follow, and the United States and Soviet Union now dominated the world stage. Britain had survived, but it was no longer unrivaled. The Second World War ended with Britain bloodied yet unbowed, its people proud of endurance and sacrifice, its leaders celebrated for defiance. Yet beneath the euphoria of victory, a sobering reality lingered. The empire was crumbling, the economy was battered, and the old certainties of global dominance had slipped away. Cities lay scarred by bombing, industry strained by 6 years of conflict, and families mourned the hundreds of thousands lost. Yet out of the rubble came a determination to build something better. In 1948, the National Health Service was founded, offering free medical care at the point of use. It was revolutionary. For the first time, access to doctors and hospitals became a right, not a privilege of wealth. Alongside the NHS came broader welfare reforms, from national insurance to council housing. After years of deprivation, there was a sense that sacrifice should lead to security, that war had earned a new social contract. But while the welfare state promised care at home, the empire abroad began to unravel. The war had drained resources and exposed the limits of British power. India, the so-called jewel in the crown, gained independence in 1947, partitioned into India and Pakistan amid violence and mass displacement. Other colonies followed, from Africa to the Caribbean, as nationalist movements surged. Britain no longer presided over the globe. It adjusted to being a mid-sized power in a world dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. Decolonization was not always graceful, but it was inevitable, and the red patches on maps that once seemed permanent shrank year by year. The 1950s and 1960s saw a society both rebuilding and reinventing itself. The rubble of wartime cities gave way to modernist housing estates and motorways. Consumer culture expanded as televisions, washing machines, and cars became household staples. Immigration reshaped the nation, as people from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa arrived to work in factories, hospitals, and transport, filling labour shortages and remaking cultural life. Britain became more diverse, though not without tension, as racism and resistance to change accompanied integration. Against this backdrop, popular culture flourished. The Beatles, emerging from Liverpool in the early 1960s, transformed music worldwide. London swung with fashion, art and film, projecting a new, youthful identity far removed from the austerity of the war years. Politics reflected both hope and upheaval. The post-war consensus between Labour and Conservative governments maintained welfare and state intervention. But by the late 1970s, the system seemed strained. Economic stagnation, strikes and inflation eroded confidence. The winter of discontent in 1978 to 1979, marked by widespread strikes and public frustration, paved the way for Margaret Thatcher's rise. As Prime Minister, from 1979 to 1990, she championed free markets, privatisation, and a break with the old consensus. To supporters, she revitalised Britain. To critics, she deepened inequality and eroded communities built on industry. Her era left indelible marks, reshaping the political landscape as much as the coalfields and shipyards she left shuttered. Meanwhile, Britain's place in Europe and the world shifted again. Joining the European Economic Community in 1973 tied the country more closely to the continent it had long defined itself against. The relationship was always uneasy, balancing sovereignty with integration, but it reflected the reality that Britain could no longer act as it once had. The Cold War made the nation a junior partner to the United States. Its empire reduced, but its alliances crucial. Britain adapted, not by commanding half the world, but by carving out influence through diplomacy, finance, and culture. The late 20th century brought further cultural transformations. Punk rock, television satire, and literature reflected both disillusionment and creativity. Multiculturalism became a defining feature of modern England, as curry houses, reggae, and Bollywood joined Shakespeare, roast beef, and cricket in shaping national identity. Sport became another marker of change, from England's 1966 World Cup triumph to the Premier League's global reach. Yet nostalgia persisted, often for an imagined England of villages, pubs, and orderly queues. The tension between tradition and transformation, empire lost and culture reinvented, defined the era as much as any political speech. Through it all, the monarchy endured, though in altered form. Elizabeth II, ascending the throne in 1952, became a symbol of continuity across decades of change. Her reign weathered decolonisation, scandal, and public scepticism. Royal pageantry remained a spectacle, but the monarchy became more ceremonial than political, surviving less by power than by tradition and spectacle. For a country often uncertain of its place in the world, the crown offered familiarity, even as everything else shifted. By the dawn of the 21st century, England stood transformed from the Empire of Victoria or the battlefield of Churchill. The NHS remained a cherished institution, even as debates over its funding raged. Thatcher's legacy lingered, shaping politics long after her departure. The Beatles had given way to new cultural exports, but music, television, and fashion continued to punch far above the nation's weight. Immigration and globalization made the country more diverse than ever, while debates over Europe and identity suggested that the old question of what it meant to be English remained unresolved. Looking back across centuries, the story is not one of steady ascent to glory. It is a cycle of chaos, reinvention, and stubborn persistence. Tribes became kingdoms, kingdoms became conquests, conquests collapsed, and each time something new was built from the wreckage. England has been raided, invaded, humbled, and impoverished, yet it has also produced Shakespeare, railways, and the Beatles. It has burned witches and discovered penicillin, built empires and dismantled them, preached virtue and practiced vice. The island's history is not tidy, nor is it linear. It is messy, contradictory, and enduring. And that brings us to the end of tonight's long march through the entire history of England. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.